Welcome to CandleLight Audiobook. The Villainess's Path to Redemption. Chapter 21. Chapter 21. The more questions John asked, the more succinct and ambiguous Lowell's answers became. The pupils of his eyes, which had just been glazed over, were now alive, and his crooked posture was improving. Only the faint red cheeks could make John guess at the amount of alcohol Lowell had drunk. John didn't notice any of those changes because he wanted to get information, and when his questioning came to an end, Lowell announced the end of their meeting. "It's almost time for my shift. I'm sorry. I'll see you again." "That's a shame. I hadn't seen you in a long time." "I think so too. It had been a while and I'm sorry it ended this way." The two men, who had risen from their seats, said goodbye in front of the main gate of the Imperial Palace. As John, with his shoulders drooping, was about to turn and leave, Lowell took his shoulder and advised him in a hushed voice, "I recommend you not inquire about His Highness anymore." "I see." Lowell's advice was appreciated, but John couldn't follow it. That was because he thought Celine, who held his future in her hand, was more frightening than the Crown Prince, whom he had never seen before. Unable to go back, John headed for the casino just in case. He was thinking the people there might have seen something. The casino was located near the Commoners' Quarter, a little far from the Imperial Palace. That was because the main source of income for the casino was the money from the poor commoners. The building that had started out as a small gambling house had grown in size as money gradually poured in, and now, it was a large building with lights that were clearly visible from very far away. Of course, that had been before the incident with Viscount Lupre. Now, that massive building was dyed black. The streets got darker and darker as he headed toward the building, so unable to see anything without a lamp, John took a portable lamp from his coat and lit it. He looked everywhere and did so meticulously, wondering if there was any speck of information he could glean. There were rare pieces of broken glass or crumbled boxes, but no sign of the Crown Prince was found. It had been a long time since he had bent down to look for traces like that, but when he looked around, he saw a familiar shop. "It's the general store." It was the general store that they had gone into to get back the hourglass. Seeing that the lights were off, he thought it might be closed. John recalled what Celine had said last time. She said that the owner couldn't use the auction ticket. How did Miss Celine know that? She had said that rumors about Viscount Lupre had been circulating, but there had been no such rumors in the Empire. He had asked around about them just in case. He had wondered where she had heard those rumors, which nobody had known. John, just in case, moved toward the general store. It seemed closed, but the old man might be inside. Some commoners used to build small rooms behind their stores and use those rooms as lodging to settle down. John counted on that. He didn't know whether the old man would tell him anything, but the old man already knew him. Since the general store was close to the casino, the old man would have seen something. "Is anybody here?" He knocked on the door of the closed general store several times, but there was no sign of movement. Were my efforts in vain? Still, he felt sorry about it. After he knocked on the door a few more times, he heard a squeak inside followed by footsteps. "We are not open. I'm here to ask you something. I'll give you 50 shillings if you answer." Rattle. The door was unlocked, and the dark-looking face of the old man peeked through the open door. The old man had opened the door only enough to make half of his face visible and reached out through the opening. John took 50 shillings out of his pocket and held it in his hand. The old man asked what he was curious about after checking if the amount was right. "Don't be too wary. Last time, I visited you as a guest. You've come to see me before?" The old man looked at John from head to toe, but he cocked his head if John was not memorable. Suddenly, the old man's eyes widened when John said he had been with the party retrieving the hourglass. "The auction ticket. Do you remember it? I one of the knights that accompanied Our Lady at the time." "Ah, I see. Please, come in." The old man gladly opened the door and let John in. He made some room for John and gave him a cup of tea. John accepted that hospitality. "I listened to the lady and sold my auction ticket. So, fortunately, I was able to keep my store. I had to pay the earnings back because I had purchased the ticket with borrowed money. That's good. You didn't come with the lady? Oh, it's personal, John answered with a yawn. He had been drained of energy from escorting Celine from morning to the afternoon. After that, he had met Lowell and drunk with him, and later, continued his search for traces of the Crown Prince. It might be because it was a hard day, but John was very sleepy. He tried to drive the rush of sleep away by gulping the rest of the tea, but somehow, his eyes felt heavier and heavier. John tried to ask the old man, who had continued to talk, for some cold water, but soon he couldn't even do the little things. Are you sleeping? Hello? The old man slapped John on the cheek a few times to make sure that he was really asleep and turned all the lights of the general store on. A little time later, the door opened with a squeak, and a few men came inside. You asked me to let you know if someone suspicious showed up by turning all of the lights, so I did, but he won't wake up for a while, said the old man, rubbing his fingers. A black-haired man nodded to him. They were near to where Viscount Lupre had disappeared, so the merchants around the casino had been summoned and told to let the man know immediately if any suspicious person appeared. It turned out that John had nothing to do with Viscount Lupre, but whoever made the report was given a reward. The truth was that the old man hadn't listened to Celine and hadn't sold his auction ticket, so he silently charged John with making up for the damages he had incurred. Check his face. Someone in the crowd identified John's sleeping face at the man's instruction. The man who checked shook his head to reveal that it was not Viscount Lupre. Instead, another name popped out of his mouth. This is John. He once worked with me as a knight. I knew him as he worked with us for years, but recently he's been hired by the Virmonts. Count Virmont's family. There was a figure in the mind of the black-haired man. It was the figure of a little girl with blonde hair. That day, he remembered her going out of the general store and riding in a carriage with that family's seal on it. I'd forgotten her because I was unable to arrest Viscount Lupre. Did they say her name was Lyra? She had given the old man advice as if she knew what would happen to him. And for that reason and because she had said that the rumors had already spread, the black-haired man had hurried to attack the casino, unfortunately missing Viscount Lupre due to his incomplete plan. He had not thought of finding the girl after his unexpected failure, but when he ran into the Virmonts' night again, he thought he should investigate Count Virmont and if he had anything to do with Viscount Lupre. Count Virmont might have been involved in the matter, as it would be difficult for a little girl to come about the information on her own. What do you want me to do with this guy? Leave him alone. The more traces they leave, the easier it will be to catch them. The man stared at John's face for a very long time, trying to engrave his face in his mind. Then, he turned at the sound of a far-off cry, disappearing to pursue the whereabouts of the Viscount. He had to figure out what had caused that mess. Chapter 22. When did I fall asleep? Oh, I was surprised that you did and so suddenly. John woke up and, rubbing his half-closed eyes, rose up from the seat. How could I not notice? It was already so late. It was as expected. I see. It was unfortunate, but there was no way for him to find out more, so John left the general store and headed for the mansion. It was a difficult time in the morning to call for a carriage, so it was not until about sunrise that he arrived at the mansion of the Count's family, and as soon as morning came, he was scolded severely by the leader of the guard. It was only half a day's investigation, but it did not yield any results, and it was not until noon that he reported that to Celine. Waiting for the punishment to fall like a bolt of lightning on his head, it never came. Rather, she urged him to stop looking into it. You don't have to show up until I call you. You didn't forget what I asked you to do, did you? Yes. Of course. Celine asked John never to reveal her name. If there was ever a situation where he had to name someone, she ordered him to mention only Lady Virmont. But you didn't hear anything last night? No. I was been waiting all night for news in the general store, but nothing. Okay. From now on, don't show up in front of me. However, stay as close to Lyra as you can. Do you mean Miss Lyra? Yes, Lyra. Okay. Celine handed him some gold coins with words of thanks, and John bowed his empty, tin-like head several times. As he left the room, Celine frowned, crumpling the fresh flowers that decorated the vases. How could he not know that Viscount Lupre was caught last night in a shabby inn near the casino? How very stupid of him. It had not been announced to the public, but when John did not return at night, Celine had sent another knight, Paul, to find out what had happened. He had said that at around midnight, the royal knights had arrested Viscount Lupre, who had been hiding in an inn closet and had intentionally dragged him out noisily. Celine thought he was a little bit foolish, but she had no choice but to doubt him because he was being much too stupid. Did he lie to me? Maybe he didn't know because he was blind and deaf. Anyway, even if she had found his weakness, keeping him close wasn't good. It would be better for her to have the stupid dog show his talent around Lyra. In the meantime, if he found something about Lyra, that would be good too. If need be, I will throw him away. There was an unknown event somewhere, but since Viscount Lupre had been arrested, the past was back and things wouldn't go awry. Lyra was still suffering with the embroidery, but Celine herself was free. As the orbit came back on track, Celine went back to re-establishing her position and making sure that she would live. Celine visited her mother after a long time. Her mother's appearance resembled a jewel, and she was completely adorned in jewels. Her mother was like a ceramic doll and dressed as such, unaware of when her life might run out. Of course, it would be natural for her not to know the future. Her beautiful appearance had brought her such a great rise in status. Perhaps content with bringing Celine into the Count's family and keeping her alive, her mother hardly called for her. She went out and spent her time passionately buying dresses and jewelry, except for when she really had nothing to do, or when she was having tea in her free time. But that didn't mean that Celine didn't like her mother or found her odd. Her mother had taken advantage of her best qualities and found her own happiness. In addition, she was a craftsman who was able to constantly sharpen her weapon despite her achievements. It was not like ordinary people would get tired and fall apart when they achieved their goals. Her mother was a craftsman, a master craftsman who lavishly polished her appearance, her greatest merit. In addition, I owe my life to you, so you deserve to be praised. As for her mother's immature behavior, it would be enough if her daughter did things right. It would be a small gift for her mother, who had wasted all the money she had earned with decorations but helped her get out of the hellish slums. The Countess, who was looking in the mirror and checking on which pair of earrings to wear, asked Celine without looking back, "What brings you here?" "I'm going out a little later, so I don't have much time." "It's no big deal. I'd like you to acquire some private tutors for me as well." "Private tutor? But, you said no before." "Well, you've changed lately." When she had first come into the Count's family, she turned down the idea of having private tutors. She remembered rolling on the floor, saying, "I hate studying." Still, some private teachers had taught Celine, saying, etiquette is essential, but whenever she had bragged about what she had learned, Lyra had repeatedly robbed her of the initiative and humiliated her. Having come to realize shame sooner than etiquette, she had been unable to keep up with her learning. But now, things were different. It was necessary to build connections to prevent the evil girl, Lyra, from playing solo. Because she was still young, she was praised for her embroidery and was able to join the group, but she knew things would be different from now on. The Celine of the past had been thoroughly ignored by other groups, other than the crowd that had praised her looks. If people wanted a pretty face, they could find a lot of that in brothels. Among the nobles, she was nothing but the shameful daughter of a prostitute who dragged Lyra down. Even though they had invited her to a party, she had just for an ornament for them to glance at, not to talk or get acquainted. That was done as an intentional form of humiliation, normally reserved for the outcasts in gatherings. If she had had pure blood, it might have been different, but a dumb little girl who suddenly rose in rank was treated less than the commoners by the nobles. Even the slightest amount of networking she had done so far would surely disappear if she stayed stupid. For now, culture, history and literature will be good. There is something I really want to learn, but it is impossible now. Well, I can learn it slowly, so I'll put my priority on building my personal network first. Celine hadn't known it before, but now that she thought of it, Lyra had had a group of people around her who would become her supporters since she was very young. She had hired them primarily as private tutors to build her personal network. The relationship between a teacher and a student was a wonderful one that would continue for a lifetime. Of course, she had not done so by her own power, but by the Count's help. Nevertheless, it was true that they were of great help. However, Celine, who was mostly neglected, had to prepare her own supporters by herself. At first, she had thought to take over Lyra's tutors, but that had been a very foolish idea. Lyra's tutors were all of high nobility and well known in many ways. Like Lyra, blessed by birth, they would be afraid of even a speck of dust from a dirty, wicked woman, so they would not even make eye contact with Celine. The group, consisting mostly of countesses and their children, treated Celine in a way even lower than dirt. Celine, who didn't know how to greet them properly, couldn't say a word to them. Among them, there were none who treated Celine, who had been born of humble status, properly. Furthermore, no matter how much she knew the future, there was only a small amount of information that she could give those with already vested interests and opinions. Maybe I could take information out of them, but there's no way to approach them at all. I don't want to be mocked. Chapter 23. Rather, it was better to recruit those who were not lucky enough to receive help, and who had a desire for power and ambition, but had failed to make them flourish. Celine wanted to be the queen of those who had been pushed aside. She had to choose people who could survive on their own if she put them on the right track, just like Corinne. Of course, Corinne will be marquise on her own. Still, I need people like her. And Celine knew those people well. In general, they were those who had money but no personal connections. There were quite a few of those whom she had met later at that same party. That was probably why they had stuck to her, who had only her beauty. Among them, Celine could recall a few men who had loved her almost to the end. They had fallen for her pretty face and given everything to her. Although they had been forced to marry noble ladies because they were heirs to their families, their expressions of regret and sadness were still vivid. Right now there was little to notice about them, but with some land and the proper investments, wealth would rain on them. Compared to the cards that Lyra had, they were not so good, but they were the ones whom she could reach out to right now. Let's test them first. If I'm lucky, I may be able to get others through them, the greater ones that will help me get rid of Lyra. Celine handed a note to her mother, listing the names of the 3 people whom she could remember. Her mother looked alternately at the names in the note and at Celine's face. She seemed to wonder if she should actually hire them as private tutors. Not to mention Lady Corinne of Viscount Lauren's family, but you have a poor eye. They will not be at all helpful. But, I can't share tutors with Lyra, can I? I think none of the 3 is knowledgeable enough to teach you. Like her mother had said, they were not very knowledgeable. They were just ordinary aristocrats. Among them, there were just 2 viscountesses and 1 baroness. But Celine had not chosen them in hopes of great knowledge either. She had only chosen them as a test. The Countess shrugged at Celine's repeated attitude and said, I can't help it if you like them. In truth, you just think it's annoying to have them investigated. The Countess handed Celine's note to her maid. It meant that the maid should hand it over to the butler, and he would be the one to write the letters with the family's seal instead. She always handled Countess affairs that way. It was not that difficult, but she limited herself to buying clothes and jewelry. Because that was nothing new, the maid left the room after getting her orders. Thanks to the sincere and clever butler, Celine was soon able to meet the 3 wives. The first one she met was Viscountess White. Nice to meet you. No matter what the rumors were, Celine was a lady of the family of the Count, and her mother reigned in power above them. That meant that Celine was a good target for Viscountess White, who was looking for a lady to marry her son off to. Celine curtsied. There was no sign of the rumors in that graceful manner of greeting. Even though Celine was lowborn in spite of her high status, she was an elegant bride-to-be, whom the Viscountess. The Viscountess, who had a hard face, smiled gently while Celine responded with a very regular expression, as it was standard. I ask you to favor me well, Viscountess White. Are you ready to play in my hands? There was no shade on Celine's brightly smiling face to Mrs. White. The liberal arts to be taught by Mrs. White were simple arithmetic subjects, including addition, subtraction, multiplication, as well as basic grammar and speech. Everything necessary to live gracefully as an aristocratic lady was included. No matter how high the status of a noble lady, women were not taught too deeply, so their studies were basic enough that anybody could teach them. Of course, some women with high status learned more and about more varied subjects, but most aristocratic ladies only learned the basics so that they would not be humiliated when they went somewhere. Therefore, education was something more akin to a simple tea party, with tea and dessert. Contrary to etiquette, there was no need to learn anything else quickly, so it was normal to maintain a private tutor until the day a lady made her social debut. Warm tea, sweet cookies, and fruit were put on the table, and Mrs. White, with an eased expression on her face, asked how much Celine had been intending to learn. "If you could tell me what you've learned before, I'll refer to it." "Nothing at all," Celine answered with a stiff upper lip while placing a cube of sugar in her teacup. Mrs. White was lost in thought for a moment due to her reply. Why hasn't she been educated yet? Although noblewomen didn't study at academies or other academic institutions like noblemen because they had to be careful about their manners, basic education was still essential to keeping the family and helping their husbands work. Basic education began around the age of 8. Progress was slow, but they made advances by being tutored by an adult woman. Prestigious families began to educate their girls when they started to speak. Because of that, Lyra had been receiving her education since even before she could run properly. So, why hadn't Celine been educated when she was already approaching 15? Mrs. White seemed to be wondering that, but Celine did not bother to tell her. However, she added some lies about her situation because she should not look pitiful like she did with Corinne. "As you know, I joined the Count's family suddenly, so I needed time to adjust. I had a lot to learn, from handling tableware to walking, sitting, and so on. I've just managed to acquire a little bit of a lady's decent character." It was only then that Mrs. White realized that Celine's behavior was impeccably elegant and natural. Despite having a very small body, her gentle movements that resembled flowing water made her look like a fairy. Celine was much more elegant and dignified than other aristocratic girls of her age. In particular, the way she raised the teacup to her mouth seemed almost like a butterfly flapping in the wind. It was not until Mrs. White was convinced of why her education was delayed that her expression eased, and she smiled again. The Viscountess thought that being able to be that graceful at an early age and in just a year showed quite a passion for her education, even though Celine had lived as a commoner previously. Viscountess White understood that the family of the Count seemed to have taught Celine etiquette first so that others would not find fault with her, and after that, they decided to move on to other subjects. The Viscountess was playing right into Celine's plans by convincing herself of that. "I see. There's been a lot of gossip about me because of all the trouble I had while I was learning. Mrs. White, you've heard them too, haven't you? Ho ho, all that gossip will quickly disappear. Never mind that." Mrs. White had also had numerous misgivings about Celine, but as soon as she met Celine for the first time, she was able to see that all those vicious rumors were lies. She was sure that others would think so too. It was a great opportunity for the Viscountess, a good chance to get acquainted with that little girl and introduce Celine to her son. At the same time, she was thinking that Celine should be able to handle due to her commoner background and that, because she had not learned anything yet, she was probably ignorant. Celine batted her lashes and smiled while looking at Mrs. White, who was playing right into her hand. "You'll have to help me a lot with that, teacher," she said. "Teacher? I'm not worth that title. Just call me Celine." "No, I'm a student, so Mrs. White is my teacher." She didn't have to pretend to be pitiful to gain sympathy like she had done with Corinne. Just being a little bit nice was enough. Chapter 24. If she acted like she didn't know anything with a smile on her face and showered Mrs. White with flattery, the Viscountess would dance like an unbridled foal. That way, the woman who thought to take advantage of Celine's power, would actually take the bait. When she was called a teacher, Mrs. White could not hide her joy, appearing very happy. The first class taught was on very simple addition. Celine already knew it, but she nodded as if she'd never heard of it before because explaining that she did would shorten the meeting with the Viscountess. 3 and 1 make 4. Look, 3 cookies and 1 cookie are 4 cookies if you put them together, right? It was not necessary to learn addition and subtraction of single digits from a teacher, but Mrs. White worked very hard to make sure Celine understood. Celine, who swallowed the laughter that was about to burst out, smiled and agreed enthusiastically. How stupid do I appear to be? You are teaching me the most basic, which can even be taught to infants. Mrs. White, who had never taught anyone before, left satisfied after about 2 hours of class. The Viscountess would probably go back and brag about her meeting with the family of the Count. She might make a plan for her son to meet Celine. She might think that it would be easy to manipulate a stupid little girl like her. Please, do so quickly. Viscountess Bloch and Baroness Serby, whom she met after that, were not much different from Mrs. White. They had the joy of creating a connection with the family of the Count, the curiosity of seeing a dumb, little low-born girl, and the ambition of somehow coaxing Celine into connecting with their sons. Their miscalculation was thinking that it would be easy to control her because Celine was not the Count's own daughter. In particular, Baroness Serby, who belonged to the lowest rank of the bunch, rubbed her palms as she stared at Celine. The smile on her face had been so awkward that Celine had struggled to keep herself together to the point of sweating. Even though Oscar is the one I'm really after, I don't intend on becoming his fiancé or marrying him. I'm just doing my best to be a thorn on Lyra's side. Isn't that the nature of a wicked woman? Not in Lyra's clumsy way, but as a real villain. Celine kept smiling throughout because of the women's very desirable attitudes and responses. However, due to that, the shape of her embroidery was distorted, so Corinne asked, "What good news have you received?" "I've been assigned new teachers. I didn't know that learning subjects were so fun." "That must be a lot of fun. What kind of people are they?" "They are very honest and cheerful. I'm sure that's all because Lady Celine is intelligent and friendly." Corinne's smile, which Celine invariably scored it as a 120 out of 100 points, made Celine feel a little more relaxed. That was her charm, which was probably how she captured that blunt marquis. The embroidered handkerchief could only serve as an instrument and a chance for a meeting. "But, I like Teacher Corinne best." "Oh, my dear miss, I like you too." As she hugged Corinne's waist and rubbed her face against her, Corinne stroked Celine's hair as if she couldn't help it. Even if Celine was learning etiquette, the adorable girl's cute action was acceptable. Since her debut into society was just around the corner, Corinne would soon meet the Marquis. Even if there was an age difference, she was also a noblewoman, so it was natural to be attracted to a man of high rank. By instilling Corinne with a little courage and stirring her up with some hope in the process, Celine would be able to solidify their relationship. "I hope Teacher Corinne will meet someone nice and be happy." It was also the future Corinne dreamed of. Corinne, who was sweeping away Celine's hair, felt affection for Celine at her insidious remark. It could have been seen as a declaration that Celine would take advantage of her if Corinne did well, but the poor little lamb couldn't have known the meaning. Oscar Frederick. Celine was relieved to have a smooth start, with a total of 4 people who would protect her future. In addition, Lyra was still quiet. Perhaps she was concerned that first-time visitors were coming and going from Celine's room, so during their most recent dinner, Lyra did not eat properly. Lyra seemed a little bit emaciated by her seldom increasing embroidery skill. It was nothing compared to what Celine had gone through, but when she saw her getting weaker and emaciated in front of her, it was so funny that she burst out laughing. "Yes, live your life as you read my countenance, just like me, whom you tricked for all my life." Perhaps there was nowhere else for her to express her worries, so Lyra sent more letters to her brother Darian, and Celine's laughter increased. It was stupid and foolish of her to rely on her brother, who was confined to a dorm and could only console her in writing. While Lyra was whining to her brother, Celine slowly formed friendships with the 3 wives and built up knowledge. The culture class, where Mrs. White still hadn't been able to progress in arithmetic, had not been very helpful, but history and literature had been helpful on their own since Celine had had no knowledge at all in those fields. All she wanted was for things to go on as planned, to build her own power by building up knowledge, to pressure Lyra, and to leak information little by little so that no one could get away from her. And she would make Lyra's engagement with Oscar, something Lyra had longed for, into nothing and would completely isolate her. In the end, she would imitate Lyra's crime by putting poison in her teacup and killing her. Looking out of the window, she noticed a gardener sweating while pruning the already neatly well-groomed garden. The gardeners, of whom there were close to 10, were paired up to give form to the garden and clean up right after. Celine, leaning against the window frame for a while, sent Jessica down again. She told Jessica to mingle with the cleaning maids to find out who was coming. Because it was the weekend, her tutors wouldn't come, and since she was tired of embroidering, she slept on her bed, waiting for the news to come. After a very short time, her eyes suddenly opened due to hunger. When she checked the time, lunchtime had already passed. Because the household kept regular meal times, her body was more accurate than the clock when it came to announcing the time to eat. Celine, who had risen from her bed, stretched to the fullest extent she could and called Jessica a few times, but once she remembered she had given Jessica other orders, she stepped out of the room. "I think I'll need another maid for petty purposes." In the quiet mansion, only Celine's quiet footsteps could be heard. "Is there a guest here already? What on earth has Jessica been doing?" There was no report at all. When she faced the hall on the first floor and stretched her feet toward the final step, she ran into Jessica, who came rushing up from below. "Jessica? Miss." She was panting, perhaps in a great hurry, but it seemed to be bad news, so Celine's heart throbbed. "Who the hell is here?" There was no need to ask Jessica the answer to that. 2 men appeared at the front door of the mansion before Celine even urged her to answer. "Darian, young Master Darian. To the mansion with Mr. Frederick." Oscar Frederick appeared with the cold autumn wind. At the age of 16, he was still a little young, but as if scattering the night sky, his very dark hair and golden eyes clearly showed how many women he would touch in the future. He shifted his brilliant eyes to the shy girl who greeted him. "Welcome, Mr. Oscar. Was it hard for you to come that long way?" "No, it's okay." The white dress with the rose-shaped red ruby on its chest showed just how much Lyra had waited for that day. A sweet, tender smile, like honey, the meaning of her name, was directed to Oscar. Chapter 25. Lyra should not be meeting Oscar yet, but her grief-stricken letter to her brother seemed to have shortened the period. Darian must have returned to the mansion, hurrying his horse through the night's dew, because of the sorrowful letters from his only lovely sister. Darian had never returned to the mansion during the semester, but apparently, when Celine saw that he had come with Oscar, she realized he seemed to have been worried about his sister. Of the weekend, the 2 days of the week when he could barely rest, he would have to spend a whole day overworking the horses pulling the carriage to and fro the academy, and the rest comforting his beautiful sister. Lyra, who was unusually lively, greeted him with sparkling eyes. Celine thought she looked despicable, smiling at Oscar, who took his coat off and gave it to his servant. Celine's hand, which was gripping the handrail, tightened. Oscar handed Lyra a bouquet of white lilies that his servant had given him. There was no way to know whether he had been the one to actually prepare them in advance. "Oh, my God. I've never seen such a beautiful and fresh flower. Thank you." Those must have been words of vain and empty formality, but Lyra's cheeks blushed with that ridiculous overture. "Yeah, let's do that. If her last moments come, I will rub those lively cheeks in the mud. It'll be worth seeing her face covered in bloody grains of sand. Go quickly and decorate my room with these flowers." "Yes, miss." Lyra asked her maid several times to handle the flowers she had received with great care. Celine would have to go back to her room first. Unlike Lyra, who was neatly dressed from head to toe, she was in very simple house clothes and with slightly disheveled hair. It was obvious that no one had spoken a word to her about the visit, and they had done so deliberately. They had to have told others to clean the mansion and groom the garden, but Celine had known nothing about it. Thinking of that, she overflowing with anger. It was at that moment, when Celine, who was biting her lower lip because she couldn't overcome her anxiety due to their warm greeting, tried to turn around. Suddenly, Oscar's eyes met hers. She didn't want to face him in those tacky clothes. She had wished to always be beautiful and elegant for him because he was the best means to drive Lyra into hell. Celine, who had forgotten the blink out of surprise, slowly stepped back. Oscar's eyes narrowed due to the unexpected encounter, and he frowned. Her heart throbbed. A figure who didn't seem to have noticed her in the past was looking directly at her. She would take the seat next to him this time. Celine couldn't even wipe the sweat off her hands to receive his gaze. It was Lyra, who followed Oscar's gaze to her, who broke the tension that seemed to have stopped Celine's heart. Faced with Lyra's frightened eyes, Celine's frozen heart quickly turned to lava. Her whole body was infused with hot blood to make her aware of the reality. Yes, it was only a little bit faster than how it was supposed to have been done, but what I have to do is clear. Only then did Celine find her true self to greet him extremely politely. Although the distance between them was significant, her elegant gesture, like that of a butterfly, was visible to everyone in the room. Oscar, too, greeted her as if he had just realized his rudeness. He had some wariness and curiosity about the stranger he was seeing for the first time. Perhaps he might be aware of the rumors about Celine, so he glanced deeply at her again, his face showing many feelings. When I got the call from you, I prepared some appetizing food. There are plenty of vegetables that brother likes, so you can look forward to them. Lyra, who watched Oscar and Celine greeting each other, changed the subject and took her brother's arm while announcing that there was food. Darian urged Oscar to move by tapping a few times on his shoulder, appearing displeased with the attention Oscar was giving Celine. Lyra, that's too much. When did I like vegetables? Come to think of it, lunchtime is long gone. Only then did Oscar and Celine look away from each other. Celine snorted at Lyra as she moved away, treating her as a non-existent person. Lyra would be the one damaged by acting like that. At times like this, she should take care of her sister, but Lyra was showing her twisted heart. It was an attitude that Celine appreciated very much. Jessica, prepare my clothes and get my hair done. Celine went straight up to her room, straightened her hair and changed her clothes. Compared to Lyra, who shone brightly, she emphasized neatness and quietness even though it would not be much of a show. It was Oscar's taste to dress neatly rather than to dress openly and lavishly. She wasn't sure where she had heard that, but according to what Celine remembered, it was so. So, the first time Lyra had met him, she had dressed modestly, without any special decorations, and refrained from jewelry as much as she had been able to. Celine, after making a few requests of Jessica and with a refreshing soap-scented perfume on her hair, headed straight for the dining hall. The meal had already started, and they were savoring the main dish. Since the Countess was absent, Lyra didn't apparently expect Celine to come down to the dining hall, so when she saw Celine, her face stiffened, and she held the fork frozen in front of her mouth. It was the same with Darian, who frowned in open discomfort. Did I interrupt you? It's been a long time since lunchtime, but nobody called me, so I came down, Celine asked, twiddling her fingers with her brow cast down. Silence fell on the dining hall when she said that no one had cared for her lunch, even though she was a lady of the family of the Count. But it was all true. Nevertheless, when Celine made that sorrowful, Lyra dropped the fork to the floor without realizing it. Clank dash. Celine trembled once with the shrill metal sound that reverberated in the wide dining hall. It wasn't intentional. She was just truly surprised, but then, Oscar answered instead of the hardened brother and sister pair, "Oh, my God. I think everyone forgot you because of my sudden visit. I apologize instead. Come on. What were you doing not preparing her meal?" There was no way to know if he had felt pity for her then, but Oscar rebuked a maid, who had been watching the situation, with a cold face. The maid quickly set the table for Celine, and Celine, who immediately thanked Oscar, sat next to Lyra. On the other side of the table, Oscar and Darian sat side by side, and Celine laughed to herself when she saw the contrast in the gazes directed at the sudden intruder. A salad sprinkled with sour dressing was placed on the table, and Oscar introduced himself first before she had even picked up her fork. "Nice to meet you. I'm Oscar, son for the Duke of Frederick." Celine's heart throbbed from his polite greeting and pleasant way of speaking. It was a totally different development from their first meeting in the past. It was nothing like in the past, when Lyra had handed Oscar a handkerchief under pretense even if it had not been made by her, and Celine had said words of reproach full of jealousy and malice to her. Oh, really? This is my new chance. Celine's jubilant look was like a deep, dark swamp, enough to draw Oscar's attention without him even noticing. Celine smiled the most beautiful of all smiles, using all the knowledge and skills she had ever acquired to face Oscar. It was the type of smile that made people's eyes glisten while they cursed her as shallow. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Oscar. I'm Celine. The contrast between her young face and her sensuous smile created a strange atmosphere. She was wearing a look that a young girl should not make, and he thought it was wrong, but he couldn't tell why. Sadly. I'm sorry, Lyra. I didn't mean charm your brother, but by the time I realized, he was already running in without knowing there was a fire. I don't think you'll have any man left on your side. Chapter 26. Darian's cheeks were slightly red as he resumed his meal with a stiff expression, as if he had been charmed. It was very natural that he'd be like his father, who had no idea of what was important and was fascinated by a prostitute. Because, since the very beginning, your family has always been dirty and ugly. The wicked woman who had killed the wicked woman was not a saint, but a simple victor who has been given the opportunity to carry out her evil deeds. It was not right for someone of the same filth to pretend to be more holy. So, the mask had to be removed. That way, they could show their ugly faces once and for all, fairly and openly. In the past, Celine had done so, now Lyra. They would take turns to reveal themselves. It was a short time, but Darian's hands when they cut the meat did so roughly, as if he were thinking that looking at Celine had been disgraceful. Celine felt sorry for him, who had already lost his strength even though there would be a lot to do in the future. Once the dining hall had fallen silent again, Celine neatly emptied the green tea ice cream topped with mint leaves and, appearing very curious, asked Oscar a question just before the meal had ended. How did you take such a long trip when you must be busy during the semester? That was a question to prevent them from having their own time. To answer the question, he would have to keep telling the story even after the meal had ended, and if he were to leave the table, Celine would have to accompany him. Either way, it was a good chance for Celine to see Lyra's distorted face. Lyra's poisonous face would certainly have a negative impact on Oscar. Oscar raised his hand to order the maid to bring some warm tea and answered Celine's question. I was becoming frustrated with being confined to my dorm, so I was glad to say yes when Darian asked me if I wanted to go out. That's a long way out. That's right. I didn't expect it to be this far out. He seemed to criticize Darian, who had brought him to such a faraway place. Darian, seated next to him, shrugged. Celine thought he wouldn't involve himself in the conversation, but she guessed he wouldn't sit still if Oscar kept mentioning him. Darian kept a stiff look on his face and read his sister's demeanor. Did you accompany him without even knowing the destination? Yes, I can say that. I see. You must be very close to my brother since you accompanied him without asking. Oh, yes. He didn't come to see you, Lyra. Celine gave Lyra a bright smile. Lyra also smiled brightly, but it was heartbreaking to see her hiding her trembling hands under the table, apparently unable to restrain herself except for her face. While sitting next to her, Lyra's trembling hands were completely visible to Celine. Unable to hide them anywhere, Lyra closed her eyes tightly and bit her lip. If I bother you more than this, you'll go wrong. Celine stopped when she made Lyra feel uneasy by stabbing at just the right place. I hope you'll get a good rest. If there's anything I can do to help, just tell me. Celine, who wiped away her bewildering smile, recreated a bright, regular face that was likely to be made by a young girl of her age. Oscar, who had been distracted by Celine's strange atmosphere, finally came to his senses and nodded. The tea for four was ready, so the time Celine would part, which Lyra longed for, became a little more distant. After taking a sip of the warm green tea, she thanked Oscar sweetly, apparently because she thought she had little time left so she should look as pleasant as possible to him. Thank you very much for the dress you sent me. It's so pretty that it's my first time wearing it. You look good. I'd like to give you a dress in return, but I don't know which one you'd like. Lyra blushed shyly and said, with me. No. She couldn't bring herself to say the last words she wanted to say. Oscar, unable to grasp her intention, cocked his head. Darian, who noticed this, asked her sister, "Why don't you go shopping together? There's plenty of time. The time has come for me to buy clothes too." In fact, it was Celine who needed clothes the most. That was because she was the only one wearing simple clothes made of cheap fabric among them, who were dressed in fancy and luxurious clothes. It was hard to think that she was a noble lady since she looked like the daughter of a commoner at best. However, as if he hadn't noticed her outfit, Darian urged Oscar to go shopping for new clothes, but Oscar looked down at his fine clothes and shook his head. "No, I've got someone to take care of my clothes. In the academy, I don't even need plain clothes. If you really need them, you, brother and sister, had better go quickly." Lyra blinked quickly and brought a cup of tea to her mouth, apparently not realizing she would be rejected. She did that to conceal her trembling lips. Celine smiled pleasantly as she watched Lyra's plan be destroyed even though Celine had not done anything. "No, I'll have to decline then. I can't leave my guest alone." "I'm not alone. Lady Celine is here." Clatter. The cup of tea held by Lyra fell loudly on the saucer. "Why do you mention Celine?" Her widened pupils looked at him with astonishment, almost as if in resentment. Of all occasions, whether it was unfortunate or fortunate, he couldn't see her ugly face because he was looking at Celine, not Lyra, and because of that, Darian, who came to face his sister's devilish appearance, could not hide his astonished face. "I don't have the talent to entertain you, but I'll do my best not to inconvenience you. Don't worry. I'm tired from riding in a carriage all night, so I can take a nap." It was time for Lyra to say she would not go out. She had offered to go out to buy clothes with Oscar, but since he wasn't going, she had no reason to go. And her brother, Darian, had to help her by saying, "I have a lot of decent clothes, come to think of it." Otherwise, Celine and Oscar would be left alone in the mansion. Numerous maids and servants were guarding the mansion, but their eyes and ears were nothing but an illusion that they could not see and could not hear. Of course, the allowances were different depending on their master, but the moment they opened their mouths even slightly to say something, in the worst case, their life would disappear. "You'd better get some rest then. It'll be tough if you are going back again tomorrow." "Thank you, lady," Celine said before her half-brother and sister had even mentioned that they would stay in the mansion. Oscar, who accepted the offer, stood up first, saying, "Excuse me." Celine, too, got up from her seat because she did not want to get caught between her half-brother and sister without him. Lyra and Darian, who had missed the timing to decline their outing, got up late. After finishing all of that work, Celine said goodbye to him elegantly like a butterfly and went back to her room without regret. As soon as the door closed, she grasped the hem of her skirt with her fingertips and expressed that day's joy by dancing lightly. "I can't help but dance on a happy day." Celine, who was humming and moving like a butterfly, soon fell down on her bed, and Jessica, who was waiting awkwardly in front of the door, opened her mouth carefully and asked, "What do you want me to do with the handkerchief that you mentioned?" "Give me that." It was the handkerchief she had prepared just in case. It was the handkerchief beautifully embroidered with a golden rose. It had been made just in case Lyra, as stupid as she had been in the past, tricked him by giving him a handkerchief embroidered by another. So, Celine, like her, decided to put the handkerchief in her sleeve to prepare for the event. It was easier for her to keep it in her sleeve because Jessica wouldn't be able to be with her at every important moment. Chapter 27. She was looking forward to seeing how that would change the future. Lyra should have looked good to Oscar, but her opportunity had passed, and Celine had already heard that he had been deceived into coming to the Count's mansion. Maybe the bouquet of lilies he had given her had been prepared by Darian. All the attention Lyra wanted to monopolize had been taken by Celine. Celine had even taken her brother's gaze. Would he be more fascinated by his stepsister than his lovely sister? Celine's throat was filled with disgust. "Jessica, give me some water." "Very cold." "Yes, miss." Drinking the ice-cold water that Jessica had prepared, a happy thought crossed her mind. How much has Lyra seethed by now? Lyra might be throwing a pillow as she prepared to go out. It was something that Celine had often done in the past. Nothing would be more interesting than if Oscar were ready to return to his mansion while her stepbrother and sister were out. The Frederick mansion was nearby, so he didn't have to stay at the Vermonts. There was a possibility that she could quit the outing at the risk of embarrassment. You have barely managed to get this opportunity, so how could you leave a vulgar, wicked woman like me alone in the mansion with him? Celine, who gave Jessica the empty cup, ordered her to find out what Lyra was doing. Just find out if she's going out or not. Jessica slipped out of the room after receiving that simple order, but Celine didn't even have to hear the answer from her because the cries of the horses rang out from the window. They were the cries of horses being tied to a carriage. She could hear them stamping their feet noisily as if they were warming themselves up before running in earnest. A moment later, thanks to Jessica, who was breathing hard and told her that Lyra was going out, Celine's mouth reshaped itself to one similar to a bewitching figure. You act as expected, Lyra. You wouldn't risk a bit of shame for your noble birth. It's easy to counter your moves. In order to achieve your goal, you must throw away your shabby self-esteem and use every means and methods you have. She had learned that from the Countess, who had already achieved her purpose, and the determination she had gained after returning to life. Jessica, leave the room. I need to rest. You can rest properly, too. If she carefully read the books she studied with the wives and waited for Lyra to return, she would be able to end her day with the best mood. After Jessica quietly closed the door and went out, Celine dove into her books for a while. The progress was so slow that she didn't need to review them, so she read in advance of the lessons she would have. The culture lesson taught by Mrs. White was so simple and easy that she finished the book quickly, so she grabbed the history book that she needed to memorize. Celine quietly laughed as she turned the pages of the thick book with the history of the ancestors of those she had met at the banquet hall. That was because those who could only mock and speak ill of others couldn't be the right ones, yet their ancestors had been recorded in a book. They had been drawn as great and incredible as the gods of mythology, even though it was clear that they had killed and plundered from others to accumulate their wealth. Those actions were praised as a small means of wisely controlling foolish and stupid people. They don't know how many people have suffered through hunger and cold since then. After that, they were busy filling their bellies, neglecting the common people, who crossed the road between life and death every day. Looking back, the same had been true of Celine in the past. Because of her sudden rise in status, she had had enough money to burn it away and spend it as she liked. I was not different. As she faced her rotten past, her mood suddenly deteriorated. She felt so uncomfortable that she decided to get some fresh air to change her mood. She recalled a handmade indoor garden, where the Countess had cultivated as a noble hobby. After taking care of it for about a week, she had left it alone, and now, the maids took care of the upkeep. She remembered that everyone in the mansion had been troubled because the Countess had planted only expensive, precious flowers. She had made a big fuss that she would like to have a tea party in the garden, but now, she didn't even know it existed. Celine headed for the place right next to the hall on the second floor. The garden had been built on the second floor, not on the first floor, because the guest room was on the second floor, so it was easier to show it off that way. As soon as she entered the garden, she was hit by a damp and hot air, which made her feel worse. She was there to refresh herself, but the atmosphere only increased her bad mood. There must be a watering can somewhere. So, she looked around for some water to diminish the heat by a bit. She thought the garden would cool down if she watered the flowers. Fortunately, the watering can was near the entrance, and Celine found it easily. She immediately picked it up and sprinkled water on all kinds of colorful flowers. The water droplets at low temperature, though not cold, managed to break down a little bit of the heat. Once she had used all of the water in the can, she filled it up again in hopes that she might be able to lower the temperature even more. The flowers on the floor had all been watered once, so only the plants that weaved across the walls or plants that had been hung from the ceiling were left, making it difficult for little Celine to water them. Still, she did not give up her desire to water the plants. She would feel very awkward and uncomfortable if she were to put the can down again just because the plants were a little high when she had just refilled it and was already holding it. One of the servants must be short. When she looked around, she saw a chair near the entrance that was knee-high. Celine stepped on it and began to sprinkle water just as the leaves surrounding the entrance brushed against her face. She knew sprinkling the leaves didn't help much, but if she didn't pour all the water out of the watering can, she would feel like she was wearing one sock but not the other, so she tried hard to justify her actions. I'm so lost in futile thought that she had just wasted her time by thinking about something that would end if she had been satisfied with what she had already done and given up. It was then that Celine turned the can upside down, thinking of emptying all the water left and going back to her room. Squeak. She thought the garden was supposed to be neglected, and that nobody would come to visit it, but entered at just the right time. Because of that, the water drenched the person underneath the plants, and Celine rushed down from the chair. Why didn't you just indicate that? If he was a servant, he should have announced his entrance. If he had knocked on the door, she could have stopped. Celine, who was about to criticize the person who had come in, was appalled when she found out that the person who had been drenched was not a regular of the house. Mr. Oscar. The same Oscar who Lyra fawned over now had water dripping down his black hair. Why are you in this garden? Moreover, you entered right as I sprayed you with water. Celine had made a big mistake, so she said, stuttering at the end and hurriedly apologizing, Oh, are you okay? I didn't know someone was coming. I am sorry. She was so embarrassed that she didn't even notice her clothes were wet as she tried to wipe Oscar's hair and clothes. That was so soaked that she thought she had to do something about it even though there was nothing she could do. Oscar, who observed the scene for a moment, stepped back and disengaged from Celine. Suddenly, the wall supporting her disappeared, and she stumbled, but he held her by the wrist to keep her from falling. Chapter 28. It's okay. I can change clothes. If you keep at it, you'll get wet too. I'm fine. And it won't do any good to clean things up like this. Only then did Celine realize her poor state, and as she looked at his horrid state, her face turned pale. Oh, my God. Oh, no. She had thought that day to be a good day, but she had ruined it all with just one go at watering the garden. If she had just gone back to her room, everything would have been fine. However, everything had been ruined by her need to cool off from the heat. Well, I'm so sorry. Will this little mistake make him angry and make him reject me as he did in the past? Will he save Lyra? Wouldn't it be useless to go through that horrible experience to have my head cut off again? Am I the one who's going to roll back into the mud again? I thought that if everything else failed but I still got my hands on Oscar, I'd see Lyra in despair, but how could I have made such a ridiculous and stupid mistake? The unexpected accident paralyzed her mind and heart. She couldn't hide her trembling hands, simply uttering an apology. Why would you come in now? She was so frustrated that the heat gathered on her eyes. Why did you come in when I was spraying water in the garden that no one ever enters? Of course, the garden had been designed to allow guests to come and go freely, but basically, it was polite to be escorted by a servant when someone moved through another's mansion. It's all right. It's my fault for running around without notice. Oscar also readily accepted Celine's apology by realizing his mistake. Only then did Celine exhale a relieved breath that had been stifling her heart. She had been so nervous that she hadn't blinked at all, so when relief washed over her, she touched her eyes. Then, he asked her with surprise, Are you crying? Yes. Am I crying? Me? Have I ever cried before? No, she hadn't. When her mother had died, she had resented her since she had been left alone in the world, and she had spit out blood just before her tongue was cut and her head was chopped off, but she hadn't shed any tears throughout. Rather, she had hated and cursed the world in the face of evil. Celine's eyes were red as she lowered her hands while asking herself why. The reason for her tears was because her eyes were burning from the heat. Oscar, who looked at her wide-eyed even though his hair was dripping with water, seemed worried. Oh, this is Oscar's true personality. He always maintained a stiff expression, but now, he looked worried. She hadn't known that because she hadn't talked to him properly. Come to think of it, whenever Celine had been mean to Lyra, he had thrust a sharp stare her way. He hadn't seemed to have any affection for Lyra, but he had been very cold to Celine before. That day, he had been the opposite. That was why he offered me a seat himself even when I showed up late at lunch. Celine's heart beat fast with excitement, feeling as if she had caught hold of his weakness somehow. Celine, whose mouth was about to rise into a smile, managed to suppress her emotions and shook her head in denial. No, no, no. I know that I made a mistake. Take my handkerchief. How lucky I am. She was able to hand her handkerchief over to Oscar just because she had decided to carry it around. Once he took that handkerchief, he wouldn't be able to give it back, much in the same way he had been tricked by Lyra's shallow trick in the past. Oscar looked at Celine's handkerchief with embarrassment. It was, of all things, a handkerchief. Though he hesitated, there was no other way, so he received Celine's handkerchief and wiped his hair and shirt, which was wet enough to attach itself to his skin, with it. He squeezed the water out of the wet handkerchief a few times and unfolded it. The embroidery, which was small, had been placed in a corner of the handkerchief, but the golden rose stood out to his eyes because there were no other patterns. It's the seal of the Frederick family. It was clearly the seal of the Duke's family, different from an ordinary rose. How did this come to be in her possession? Celine blushed, hesitated, and answered the silent question. I made it because it's a beautiful seal. You are the first guest I've received in the mansion, so I made it just to keep it to myself. Does that displease you? I don't think so. It was very meaningful to receive an embroidered handkerchief with a family seal from a woman. A small one was given to the gentleman escorting a lady to a banquet, and a large one to a lover or husband. In addition, because the seal of each noble family was a flower, men began courtship by giving flowers that matched the seal of the woman's family, and received a handkerchief embroidered with the seal of the man's family from the women in return. Handing over a handkerchief without any pattern was also an act of interest in the other person, and an ordinary aristocratic woman was careful to do so with caution. How will he react? Even if it had a deep meaning, there would nothing more shameful than him handing the handkerchief back after receiving it. It was more polite and common sense not to return the handkerchief, even if it was to be confined deep in a drawer. And he had to return a favor for a handkerchief. How will Lyra react if she sees it? Her heart beat fast. The thumping against her chest and her shaking body overcame her as she waited for Oscar's decision. He looked down at Celine's embroidery for a long time, a handkerchief embroidered with the seal of his family, which had been given by a lady he had met for the first time, and the lady was right before his eyes. Celine did not make any foolish expressions to entice him or pay attention to him. She merely expressed being shy about the man of the very family of the embroidered rose having seen the handkerchief. That way, he would be less burdened by his choice. He clasped the wet handkerchief in his hand without a word. Whether he didn't want to escape common sense and courtesy, he asked, "May I take it with me?" More and more of Lyra's past became hers, and her own past was becoming Lyra's. Celine smiled brightly and replied, "Of course." Oscar walked right out of the indoor garden with the wet handkerchief. He had wiped the water off his face and body roughly, but he needed to take a proper bath and change clothes. Celine accompanied him and ordered a servant that she had run into to help him. Wouldn't you rather go back to the Duke's mansion? She hoped so. Unfortunately, Oscar didn't want to. No, my father doesn't know I'm in the capital, so I'll be scolded if I go back there. Because it was the Academy's ideology to devote oneself to learning far from the world, unless something special happened, it was normal for most students not to return home during the semester. Sometimes there were students who sneaked back due to homesickness, but most were scolded severely and returned to the Academy. If they could not bear that much, they were asked how they would carry on their family's legacies. A smile crept on Oscar's mouth when Celine smiled softly at the words that he would be scolded. "I'm afraid your clothes will be uncomfortable." He had come to the mansion empty-handed, without a single private servant. The clothes he was wearing were wet, so he had to wear clothes prepared for the guests of the mansion. It had to be uncomfortable for him to have turned down Lyra's request of going shopping with him. "I sent a servant out earlier because I didn't bring any extra clothes." "Oh, that's why you came to the garden alone." It had been strange that there had been no one in the house to follow him. Chapter 29. Oscar had sent a servant to the designer in charge of his clothes, and in the meantime, he had intended to look around the mansion to relieve his boredom because he couldn't relax in his uniform. His attitude towards Celine had softened due to various misunderstandings. She could have kept talking until the servant had come back, but at that point, she had to pull herself out. It was better to leave a little bit of regret than to spend time with useless chatter. Then please, rest in peace. Yes, you too. Oscar's eyes were glued to Celine's back, which headed to the third floor. In many ways, it was natural to pay attention to her, who was unlike the rumors. Even if his interest was not born out of her being of the opposite sex, she was enough to attract his interest as a person. Oscar thought of Celine's enthralling smile, which he had seen in the dining hall. It certainly wasn't a look she should have been able to make at her age. Then, he seemed to have lost his words for a while due to her beautiful face, which had attracted him instantly. On the other hand, the fact that no one had called her even though lunchtime had already passed, or that she had been watering the garden by herself, or that her eyes had welled with tears even though she had only made a small mistake confused him. What in the world is she really like? No, are both versions real? He could see her turn around when he approached the stairs. He didn't know if it was by coincidence, but somehow his eyes seemed to have run into Celine's, so she looked at him questioningly. The fragile look he had just seen was gone, but she had a strange look about her, the one he had seen at the dining hall. Oscar shook his head, thinking, what would I do with such a thought? It was a useless conjecture that didn't help at all. Their relationship would end as soon as he sent someone to return the handkerchief. At least, he thought so. Lyra and Darian returned to the mansion shortly after going out. Because they had wanted to go out with Oscar in the first place, his absence had been like a gift box with no content, which was of no use for anything. Even in that short period of time, Lyra had bought several items, including something to present to Oscar. However, for fear that Oscar would reject her gift, Darian acted in her stead. Oscar had just finished a bath, so his hair was slightly wet. When Darian saw him, he cocked his head questioningly. I was uncomfortable. You washed up at this time of the day because you were uncomfortable? Darian's gaze went out of the sunny window. It was only 3 in the afternoon, so he couldn't understand how he had been so uncomfortable that he had needed to wash. I even had new clothes brought in. Oh, that's right. Your clothes are different. Oscar was dressed in his favorite style of garment, so Darian shrugged, thinking that he had ordered a servant to bring him new clothes since there was no such design among the guest garments prepared by the family of the Count. Take this. What is it? Didn't you say you lost the nib of your pen? I bought this when I remembered it. When Oscar opened the fancy box that Darian had given him, he saw at a glance that the finely made nib was of higher quality than the old one he had lost, and it should have cost double the price. Did you buy this yourself? Usually, it was Darian who said that the nib and the ink were consumables, so he could use any kind. Oscar did not sign important documents with his pen since it was an object that was supposed to only be used at the academy. Perhaps Darian understood the meaning behind Oscar's question, so Darian fake coughed. He had told Lyra about it, thinking the item to be extremely necessary for Oscar, but now that Darian thought about it, after having given it to Oscar, it was somewhat strange. You can think of it as a birthday present. That was a while back. Oscar's birthday was only 3 months ago, so Darian stormed out of his room in anger, saying that Oscar was too talkative. Whatever it was a nib that he had already received. There was no immediate inconvenience to having extra ones, but only one was enough, so he felt uneasy. He thought it wouldn't be too bad to accept it since it had been a long time since Darian had bought him anything. Darian usually just brought him presents, so even though the act had been a little ambiguous just now, it had not been strange. Most of the gifts he received were sent by his sister, Lyra, but Darian often told him the truth after he gave them to him, so he could not return them, using them instead. It was a shameful insult to return goods received from a lady. That may be the case this time as well. The nib might be a present from Lyra. It was a small gift, though he felt it burdensome when he thought of returning it as the act could hurt Lyra's feelings. Any fool would understand the kindness she was showing him. Oscar was in agony for a moment. But, as always, he put the present on the table without returning it since it was clear it was a gift from her. Anyway, there had been a lot of marital talks between them, so suddenly refusing her was not desirable for him. As the successor of the Duke, he considered his family's benefit a priority and so chose to act without discrediting their honor. It was the same this time. Lyra was an elegant and graceful woman, who had also been welcomed by the family of the Duke. He didn't have to go out and try to be friendly, but causing trouble by returning the gift was not necessary. Thinking that way, Oscar looked at the nib on the table. That evening at the dinner table, Lyra made sure to ask about the nib. Oscar answered her casually, having already guessed that she had bought it. "I got it just in time. I was having a hard time since losing my old one. I thought it would be necessary since you learn at the academy." "I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you for your concern." Celine looked at the warmth between them and put the salad in her plate in her mouth. She thought Lyra's gift was certainly one-sided, but he had to have accepted it to some extent. Well, she guessed that was why he had responded to begin with. Obviously, when she had talked to him in the garden, there had seemed to be a lot of room for intervention, but not now. Although they did not seem to be close to each other, she felt a sense of stability between them, without a hint of awkwardness. Is it trust? That was all she could see. Perhaps it was the trust in each other's families, in their origins and nobility, and finally, in their statuses and temperaments that would not clash with or damage each other. It was all that Celine couldn't have. She had the same last name as Lyra, Vermont, but it wasn't originally hers. At the same time, she came from humble origins, and the rumors surrounding her were terrible. She became irritated when she saw them conversing in that harmonious manner, as if from the beginning there'd been no room for the humble to intervene. If I bring up the handkerchief story here, how would Lyra react? Would she keep that pretty face? Or would she look like a demon? Oscar would be embarrassed by her. The same would be true of Darian. The warm atmosphere would end immediately. That would be worth seeing. Celine's hand holding the fork was energized. The back of her hand and fingers turned white. But such a foolish act for a moment of change in the mood was nothing for the Celine that had died in the past. If she talked about her handkerchief for no reason, Oscar might figure out she'd given it to him because she had indecent desires for him. Anyhow, it wouldn't be long before she got it back. She could see Lyra's broken face then. Chapter 30. Celine devoted herself to the meal without expecting the conversation to turn in her direction. It was different from the day before, when she had drawn their attention. She didn't know what kind of conversation had gone on between her stepbrother and stepsister, but they were completely rejecting Celine. Celine cut the meat halfway through, making sure there were no particulars in their conversation. Unfortunately, she couldn't get much information. She was just able to understand that Lyra and Oscar were not very close. When Darian urged Oscar to answer Lyra's one-sided questions, Oscar did so briefly. How should I get between those two? Rather, that was the problem. They didn't seem particularly close, but their relationship had continued. Accepting that as if it were natural, like air, the conclusion of their courtship would be engagement and marriage. If they had had a close relationship, she might have been able to break through the gap, but she didn't know what would be needed to break a relationship like that. Even if Oscar became interested in and liked Celine, she felt like he would still become engaged to and marry Lyra. Is he the type of man who would fall for a honey trap? Or do I have to pretend to be miserable? She thought both might work. The whole thing was very ambiguous. I'll have to try both of them. First, he had to pay her back for the handkerchief. Only then would she be able to start. So for now, she had to stand still, making sure not to blame the pair of anything. She needed time. As she was lost in thought, the speed with which she ate her meal slowed down, so Oscar asked her, "Is something bothering you? Are you okay?" He looked worried. "Are you sick?" "No, I'm fine." "Oh, I got it." Pretending to be miserable works. When she tried to put the meat in her mouth with an awkward smile, his worries further increased. If Lyra had not dropped the fork frivolously, he would have brought Celine some water. Celine swallowed a bright smile into her mind. Oscar and Darian returned to the academy early the next morning. The Countess, who had not returned to the mansion for days, having apparently become interested in something recently, felt sorry about her absence after learning of it. She called Celine in secret and asked about how Oscar had been in the mansion. Well, nothing in particular stood out. It was a good chance, so I feel sorry I wasn't here. Whose chance was it? Was it for Lyra, who could see him more often than her? Or for Celine, the one who had seen him for the first time? The Countess's dark red lips drew a crescent-shaped, sad line. But her mouth soon recovered liveliness. Not long after they returned to the academy, Oscar's repayment for the handkerchief arrived at the mansion. 2 gift boxes were delivered under the name of the family of the Duke of Frederick. The butler, who identified the messenger from the family of the Duke, informed Lyra about this. Celine, who was just preparing to go out for a meeting with the young ladies, was unexpectedly able to find Lyra at the front door of the mansion, sweeping the gift boxes with her palm. Around her were the butler and several maids, all of whom poured their blessings on the gifts she had received from Oscar. I guess it's in return for the nib I gave him last. I think Mr. Oscar has a deeper heart than the sea. The errand man pulled out a paper and spread it out. It seemed to explain the contents of the boxes. From a little distance, Celine watched with great excitement to see if one would be hers. These are gifts from Mr. Oscar. Of the 2 gifts in total, the box with the red ribbon is to Ms. Lyra, and the box with the blue ribbon to Ms. Celine. He asked me to give it to Lady Celine. The gift-giver stammered while he referred to Celine's name. He had simply been told to take gifts to the Vermont mansion, so he hadn't known to whom the gifts were. Celine's unexpected name made him rearrange his monocle once and blink. He seemed quite embarrassed. The same was true of those present. As soon as Celine's name was mentioned, questions and surprises appeared on their faces. Why? Everyone knew that Lyra was constantly Oscar's favor and had sent him gifts. Her gifts were unique, but they were also rewarded, so they had thought it was the same thing again this time. In addition, the 2 people might end up married later. They were welcomed by each other's family, and Lyra liked him to the extreme. Oscar didn't refuse her either. However, Celine was somehow included in the rewards this time. Why did she get the same number of gifts as Lyra when she had no contact with Oscar? Behind the astonishment and the questioning was a great curiosity. He couldn't have sent the gift for no reason, so there must be something. Why are you all gathered so? The Countess, who looked as if she was about to go out, appeared with her servant and some knights. All the people in the hall bowed to her and showed her courtesy. The same was true of the messenger from the Duke's family. Oh, isn't this the seal of the Duke's family? The rose on the top of the gift boxes denoted their sender. The seal on the large boxes indicated that the contents within it were not ordinary. Celine answered the Countess's question. These are gifts from Mr. Oscar, and he sent me and Lyra 1 each. Celine, to you? Her eyes widened with astonishment, and Celine replied the expression with a cute look, as if she didn't know anything. Yes. He just took my handkerchief a while ago, so it must be something in return for it. He took your handkerchief? By the end of the Countess' question, the hall was filled with silence. What did she say now? Oscar took Celine's handkerchief? All eyes were on Lyra. They did not look directly at her, but glanced at her behavior, questioning why he had taken Celine's handkerchief and not hers. Lyra, who had never dreamed of that, could not answer anything, but clenched her fists until her knuckles were white. Would you give me the letter? The Countess reached out to the messenger from the Duke's family. A letter was attached to the gift to show its purpose and reason. It was polite to enclose a letter with a gift, as they had to know for sure who had sent it. Then, the messenger took out the letters he had kept in his arms. He had not understood why the Duke's family had given him 2 letters, but now, he knew it was because he had to give them to both of the girls. He had thought they had all been addressed to Lyra, but then, he looked closely and saw that the receiver's name was different on each envelope. The Countess identified the names on the envelopes and gave them to Celine and Lyra. Everyone was curious about the contents of the letter, which were firmly sealed by the rose-shaped wax. Although Celine did not have to share them with others, the Countess gently suggested reading the letters to appease her curiosity. I think there is nothing great in my letter, so why don't you read Lyra's letter? No one was curious about the contents of Lyra's letter. It was Celine's letter that everyone wanted to know. She didn't seem to have had any particular relationship with him in their last meeting, so they were all wondering when their relationship had begun and how it had progressed to her giving him a handkerchief and receiving a gift in return. But no one could bring their real intentions out of their mouths. It was a great disrespect to be curious about their master's personal life. They just read each other's countenance, all except for one person, Lyra. She was nearly insane with curiosity about the contents of Celine's letter. She wanted to find out the contents somehow, even if the contents of her letter were disclosed. Then, I'll read it first, so Sister Celine can follow me. Ah, poor Oscar. Does he know that his letter is about to be made public? If it has a beautiful poem, it will be to his credit. Chapter 31. Celine's eyes grew round. Lyra's mind had become impatient, and that's when Celine hesitated to answer, asking herself if she was about to advise Lyra of her rude behavior. I can't because it would be rude to Oscar. Besides, I have to go out. Can I open the box? Celine, who checked the time, asked impatiently, and the messenger nodded. She had been late for her last meeting to make a show of her simple dress, but she no longer intended to be late. Celine called out several maids and ordered them to open her box. Among them was a maid who always stood next to Lyra and maintained a bad expression when looking at Celine. Her pale complexion and slow hands seemed to worry about her master. What a beautiful thing it is. Inside the box were a dress, shoes and hair ornaments. The Countess was impressed by the light pink dress. Although it seems modest, it was of the highest quality material, and a small star-like diamond was embedded along the neckline. The rose-shaped waist decoration brightened the slightly dull-looking design. It has been a while since you've gone now, so wouldn't it be better to change? Even dainty pink shoes and hair ornaments. Those would make her stand out in that day's meeting. But Celine shook her head, checking the time. She had not yet planned to go to a meeting decorated to the fullest. I'm going to have to wear just a hair decoration. I think I'll be late for the meeting if I don't leave quickly. I'm going now, Mom and Lyra. Celine, who took the golden rose pin, ordered all the gifts to be brought to her room and left the mansion. When she gave one last glance sideways at Lyra, she saw the girl was nearly leaning on her maid after having lost all her liveliness. The look of the maid looking down at her was not very different. On the wagon, Celine confirmed Oscar's letter. There wasn't much to it. He had been very grateful for the loan of her handkerchief in the garden, and he sincerely hoped she would accept it back. It was a good thing that I didn't read it. If she had read it, it would not have created any unnecessary misunderstandings. It would have made her efforts futile. Of course, there had been an accident in the garden, but he had given her an excessive gift for the handkerchief. Is it because it was a handkerchief he took? She had heard that there were many men who would send clothes and accessories because they wanted the girls to wear them in their next meeting. Of course, Celine had received plenty of gifts in the past without having to give anything first. But it was too much to expect the same from Oscar. My clothes must have looked shabby and pitiful, as expected. Otherwise, he wouldn't have sent a dress. She hadn't meant to go that far, but his reaction had been grand, so she was very thankful for that. What shall I do in return? He would not want something in return, but she had to send something to continue the relationship. He should feel burdened by it and contact her again. It should be something very expensive and precious, for example. It would be very burdensome if a young lady who dressed in simple clothes sent a luxurious gift. A ring or a necklace? Either wouldn't work. What about a brooch? What do you think? When Celine asked them all of a sudden, the two knights escorting her looked puzzled. She didn't ask for an answer. Rings were interchangeable between lovers, so that was impossible, and so were the necklaces. Brooches were the best fit for a student, so the answer was already decided. Celine, recalling that the color of the academy's uniform was black, smiled a furtive smile. Any colorful brooch would suit him well. It would be perfect if he could wear the brooch that he would receive as a present. Even if he were to give it back, saying, "I feel burdened by it," she would have an excuse to meet him. Let's give him a brooch as expensive, colorful and luxurious as possible. Jessica, how much money do you have in hand? I think I'll have to buy something a little more expensive. I didn't bring much today, but you'll be fine because you have an ID. That meant that she could put it under the name of the Vermont family. That was because Count Vermont's business was so big that his family was given great credit since they could afford everything but the imperial palace. Tell the wagon driver to stop by the jewelry shop when we come back. I want to visit the largest and most expensive jewelry shop in the capital. Yes, miss. Silence sank in the carriage. It was not just quiet. They felt like she had finally shown her true colors. That was what Celine felt since she had been seeing those people for quite a long time and was able to grasp their feelings with her very being. Besides, she hadn't shaken her image as a bad girl yet. He sent me such a pretty present. I have to pay Oscar back somehow. Ah. Yes, miss. I'll tell the driver to go to the best place in the capital. That was why Celine added that excuse. When she did, the atmosphere that had become heavy eased a little. All of them had confirmed in the foyer that Celine had received a great gift. Suddenly, Celine sympathized with Lyra. Lyra must have tried hard to hide the rottenness in her heart and the smell of gutter burning within her. Celine couldn't know, but she was sure that Lyra had continued to make all sorts of useless excuses like she had done now, to avoid having her inner feelings caught. Poor life. So don't you think I should end it? What would you do if you lived a more miserable life? If your head was chopped off and rolled across the ground, you would no longer have to make unnecessary excuses by hiding your true self. I think I'm a savior of your life, which is filled with only lies. Celine looked out of the window and smiled slightly. Revenge. The main topic at the meeting was Celine's new hair ornament. The hairpin Oscar had presented her was luxurious and beautiful enough to be talked about. There were some who questioned the fact that the ornament was of a golden rose, but they did not bother to point it out. This was because the seal of a great family was often used for various decorations. The rose of the family of the Duke of Frederick, in particular, was very widely and commonly used. Celine blushed shyly at their praises and presented each one with a handkerchief she had prepared. Unlike the last ones, those handkerchiefs embroidered with the seals of the families of each of the young ladies was enough to raise her stature. A young lady who had shown great interest in Celine at the last meeting had told her family about that meeting and Celine, and very surprised, they desired to invite Celine to their mansion at once. What did she say? Seeing that the young lady had spoken so excitedly about her, it seemed to be a good sign. Thankfully, one by one, they were swayed by the show that Celine was putting, and she could see that they thought of her differently now. Celine smiled brightly and thought, there's nothing to be gained from this meeting. There was no big impact because this was a gathering of ordinary people, all except for Corinne. It was a gathering of nobles who had had no power in the past, had no power in the present, and would have no power in the future. It was a waste of time that would gain her nothing. If she distanced herself, her thoughts would become anxious because of Corinne, but she was finding it annoying to keep coming to these gatherings. Thinking back to Lyra's relationships, there seemed to be no such useless connections. She had always dealt with men of power. What shall I do? I can meet Corinne in class, so shall I just skip this next meeting? However, because she was already somewhat part of the group, it would be strange for her to quit the gathering suddenly. If she did, she was sure to put Corinne in an uncomfortable situation as well. So, Celine tried to swallow her irritation. She couldn't show a frown. Chapter 32. The meeting took as long as 5 hours because of a small boat ride by the lake. Nevertheless, Celine, who had kept her soft expression the whole time, suddenly felt a strange feeling as she climbed onto the carriage, receiving an escort after the meeting had barely ended. Who are you? Yes? That's not the same coachman. Why has the driver changed? It was not the driver who had accompanied her when she had left the mansion. It wasn't the face she had seen at a glance during the day. Perhaps not aware of the fact, Jessica's eyes widened. Celine pulled her feet off the stairs to carriage and headed around to the driver's seat. With his back bent beside the horse, he did not raise his face, so she stared unspokenly at him. He was shivering slightly. The escort knights also looked perplexed, as if they had not noticed him. As the eyes of the three turned to him, the driver flinched once and replied as if he was going to wither away. "Sue, suddenly, he said he had a stomach ache, so I'm here to replace him." He had a stomach ache? Suddenly? Yes, yes. The man who had a stomach ache went back to the mansion and traded places with you? When she pointed that out sharply, he waved his hand and strongly denied that. "Oh, no. I heard it happened after he went home for lunch." "So, you're saying that he went home without my permission?" "I'm sure he should have eaten the lunch provided by the mansion." Well, that's... I'm not sure either. I'm just here to pick you up on his behalf because his wife informed the mansion in a hurry." The driver's back became damp, and the color of his clothes became darker. The new driver didn't seem to be ill, but he was sweating too much, so she wondered if he was. It was weird. The situation was weird, and the excuses were strange. She couldn't help but wonder. Celine ordered the two escort knights and Jessica to check the face of the driver. "Make sure he is a driver from the mansion." "He is. His name is Elect. He's been working in the mansion for over 30 years. He's worked long enough to reach retirement." "Really?" When she heard Jessica's words, she slowly revived her memories of the past, and she felt like she had seen him once or twice when she had passed by the stable, although she had never met him in person. Her feeling that something was odd was clouding her memories, so she couldn't remember him. This ensured his status, so she knew he was not suspicious, but... Why didn't either of you report to me first? By the way, why didn't they report it to me? Celine was their master now, no matter how urgent or important their affairs. They should have asked her to be excused. Furthermore, even if they had traded places due to unavoidable circumstances, they should have reported it to Celine before doing it. If she hadn't had a good eye, she wouldn't have known that the driver had changed and would have entered the carriage. If it hadn't been a driver that had worked in the mansion for 30 years, and it had been an assassin. Celine shook her head faintly at the supposition that she hated to imagine. What on earth is the purpose and intention of this man? Was it simply a trick to deceive his master? It was an incomprehensible act no matter how she thought about it. Celine's expression lost in thought grew colder and colder, and the driver's voice grew more panicked. It was very urgent. Oh, really? That means that if something urgent happens, you can throw away your master and run away. Would you guys do that? When Celine asked the knights and Jessica, they desperately denied it, saying they would never do that. Celine's mouth twisted. They say they wouldn't do that, so the drivers must be very unusual. How could the two drivers behave the same way? She handed a handkerchief to the driver, who was dripping with sweat as if he had been soaked in sweat or caught in the rain. Celine smiled so sweetly that his vision blurred, as if he had been charmed. When you go back, tell the Countess of your sins clearly. You as well, Celine added after turning to the guards. Because both her speech and expression were soft, they belatedly realized that they were being reprimanded. Those who watched her party from afar would think that they were talking warmly to each other, though the content of their conversation was unknown. Why didn't you know that the driver had changed? Who the hell are you escorting? Do you think you're on a picnic? They had not known that the driver had changed, thought they should always be on alert, watching the surroundings to help keep Celine out of danger. The knights, who had nothing to say and could not answer, kept their eyes on the ground. Why are the knights we employ so useless? She wanted to be angry in her own personality, but she could not, so she got on the carriage, suppressing her irritation. There were enough slaves to make fools of two knights. After her, they followed, and Jessica climbed into the carriage as well. Miss, shall I take you to the jewelry store? Jessica asked her carefully in that harsh atmosphere. Celine nodded silently, looking out the window. The carriage began to move slowly after Jessica's delivery of the destination. Somehow, its movements were rough, which was unusual. It also seemed to be creaking. They had sent a fool who didn't even know how to drive a carriage. A sigh of frustration escaped her chest and rang in the quiet carriage. Once the Count returned, she would ask him to change the knights immediately. Why was every one of her escorts incompetent? When there was danger, the rug was pulled from underneath them, and they weren't even able to detect changes in their surroundings. She thought it would be safer to have a private escort. I don't think anyone sent this driver on purpose. At the moment, such a thought came into her mind, and Celine's eyes opened a little wider. Don't tell me. It wasn't intentional, or was it? Why didn't I think about that? So far, Lyra has eaten her heart out with anxiety, but it would be strange and out of character for her to remain that way. Although the methods were slightly different, it wouldn't be strange at all for that to be her doing, even if she moved things up by a few months. No matter how much Celine had changed, they would not hold good feelings toward her. They were not just servants in charge of cleaning and managing the mansion. They were servants directly under Lyra's control. They knew exactly who had caused their master to sigh. Even if they hadn't known, Lyra would certainly create a reason for their animosity with a single drop of one of her tears. They who supported Lyra were the most capable and influential figures of the mansion, and it would not be difficult for them to win the butler over to their side to make sure he picked stupid escorts for Celine if they wanted to. Celine went through the guards sitting opposite her. They had straight postures and firm mouths, and their intelligent eyes proved that they were valiant knights. Sometimes, however, the way their eyes shook made her wonder if they were emotionally unstable. Have I really been playing in Lyra's hands without even realizing it? Lyra was playing dangerously, not like the carefree bullying of the past. Not everyone would be intelligent and able enough to be a knight. Some of them might be excellent, but some might be emotionally unstable, and others might be distracted by their surroundings. Some might even perform poorly. What if my escorts are those types of people? If she didn't face any particular danger, it would not matter, so she would end up just letting it pass, but if she did, she might lose her life. They might throw her away like two knights who had done that after being threatened not too long ago. Her whole body was horrified when her thoughts got that far. Lyra, what a bitch you are. If her prediction was correct, Lyra was the worst among the bad bitches. Celine had thought Lyra had been filled with anxiety from her silence, but she had slowly planned putting Celine's life in jeopardy, little by little. Chapter 33. Yeah, you wouldn't. You couldn't have been made unstable by me so easily because you were the one who put me to death. I underestimated you too much. Of course, you did say you wanted to kill me from the first time you saw me. No matter how innocent Celine pretended to be, there was a big difference between her and Lyra, who had been their master since birth. It would be a piece of cake for her to dominate the servants and maids in the Vermont mansion. Perhaps, she might have even shed angelic tears and urged the maids to get revenge on Celine in secret. Celine had enslaved two stupid knights while thinking it to be an opportunity since she hadn't known that. How could this happen? Miss, we're here. When she was shocked to reach that conclusion, the carriage stopped and Jessica announced that they had arrived at the jewelry shop. Celine got out of the carriage with the help of one distracted knight. Celine's handkerchief, sweat-soaked and wet, jetted out of the pocket of the stupid driver's pants as he waited in front of the carriage. I can't believe I've not thought of anything while carrying these guys around. Celine showed a self-mocking smile, thinking that she could not deceive her humble birth. You go back first. I'll find my own way back. At that, the driver opened his eyes wide, and his chin trembled, as if he was embarrassed by the sudden order. Although his status was confirmed, the sudden change in driver was unreliable. It was strange that the former driver had had a stomach ache all of a sudden, and that he hadn't reported it. And the strangest thing of all was the demeanor of the driver, who had become very agitated by the words, "Go back." Isn't it strange that you're more uncomfortable with being told to go back than when I rebuked your mistakes? It was clear that something was up, and the creaking of the carriage made that more evident. Don't tell me. I'd rather go back in a rented carriage. Will you get me another carriage? Celine asked one of her escort knights. Preparing the carriage was a servant's job, not a knight's, but his master had ordered him to do so, so he couldn't protest. In addition, there already was some reticence about their capabilities since the knights hadn't noticed the change in driver. Celine was more than qualified to instruct the knight to find a new and safer carriage. The driver tried to say something, as if he was trying to excuse himself, but soon, he bowed and said goodbye. Celine responded to it with a friendly smile, passing him on the way to the jewelry store. Perhaps because it was a jewelry shop favored by the nobles, the interior was colorful, and it was filled with jewels of sizes and sheen that could not be easily found. The glass of the cabinet was very clean and transparent, without a speck of dust. Even at closer inspection, they could not see one blemish. The jewels on display exemplified their worth. "Come in, please." Two staff dressed in neat suits greeted Celine politely as soon as she opened the door, without a single distraction. It was an undisturbed and moderated greeting. They did not raise their heads until Celine gave them their instruction. Their conduct was impeccably perfect since they were accustomed to dealing with mostly high-ranking nobles. "I'm looking for a brooch." "Yes, I see." The employee who guided Celine to a private room on the second floor immediately served her a portion of snacks such as cookies and chocolates with warm tea. He bowed a step away from Celine, who was sitting on the sofa savoring the tea, to indicate a request for her requirements. "It's a brooch for a man in his late teens. Show me everything, from flashy designs to neat ones." Although Celine was still young and dressed in simple garments, the man did not relinquish his politeness. He wasn't unconditional in how polite he was to a customer, but no matter how simply she dressed herself, he could tell the ranking of her family by the maid accompanying her. Of course, he could also tell a customer's ranking by their family seal, but no such seal adorned either Celine or her attendants currently. A golden rose pin stood out on her head, but there was no girl in the Frederick family who was in her early teens, so he concluded that the pin was being worn simply for its beautiful shape. Nobles were originally full of bravado, so even if the store showed them expensive jewelry that they couldn't afford, they would not lose their composure. But the servants and maids were different. If they found their master could not afford something, there were slightly noticeable changes to their demeanor. Most of the nobles accompanied by servants did not carry money themselves, so the servants took that job. For that reason, they had a good idea of how much money their master had. Her maid, Jessica, did not move at all when Celine told him to show them all the brooches without specifying the amount. The maid just nodded from behind Celine as if it were quite natural. He didn't know her face, but she wasn't a normal noblewoman. Even if he brought her the most expensive brooch, she would buy it if she liked it. The staffer, who took only the most precious and expensive things out of the cabinet and put them side by side on a silk tray, went back to Celine's room without hurrying. "I've picked only the most expensive and precious things in the store." Celine glanced over the brooches that were presented to her. As the employee had said, she saw a row of precious things, none of them ordinary. Thanks to all the fancy jewelry and accessories that she had seen in her days as part of society, she had no difficulty telling their worth. Since the staffer's suit was black, she picked up the brooches one by one and put them on his clothes. All the brooches looked good, but after comparing various items, she chose the blue diamond, which was set in the middle of a brooch. The deep, dark blue color somehow caught her heart. Although the design was not fancy, it was obvious even at a glance that the size and shine of the design were not usual. "Will he like this brooch? I hope he burdened by it." The blue diamond was so rare that it was worth the sum of all the dresses and ornaments he had sent so far. She thought that jewel would be good. "Wrap it up for me." "Oh, and I'd like to have some small brooches made too." "How small would you like them?" About the size of a thumbnail?" Because there were some writing instruments on the table, Celine explained her idea in detail. She wanted a golden brooch the size of a thumbnail carved with the seal of the Viermonts, where every petal was a small ruby. Only then did the staffer realize she was from the Viermont family and gulped. He did so because he knew Lyra's face well, so she could not be her. In fact, he thought she might be the daughter of the rumored prostitute. He was told that she looked like an evil spirit, but he hadn't received a detailed description of her appearance. Looking at her now, he thought she was a charming girl, far from an evil one. In addition, unlike the rumors, she did not make any trouble, but was elegant enough to compare her to any other aristocratic lady. She had a good eye, one that appraised differently from other aristocrats, who would try to find fault while pretending to know about the craft. The staffer treated her even more politely then. "How many would you like to order?" "Let's start with 5. It'll take about a day. That's quick. Then, bring them tomorrow with the brooch I bought today. Yes. The jeweler had a close relationship with the craftsman in the capital, so he was able to respond directly to customers' custom orders. After the order was finished and payment had been settled, a receipt for a huge amount of money was held in Jessica's hand. I'd like to enclose a letter. Chapter 34. I was going to ask you about that, and thank you. I'll bring all your items to the mansion sometime tomorrow morning. This is a gift for you, Miss Celine Vermont. The employee took a case from his sleeve. It contained a sapphire necklace. Judging by the size of it, it was likely to cost quite a bit. Celine immediately understood his intention and accepted his insidious thought. Jessica, will you hang it around my neck? Yes, miss. It was probably a necklace unsuitable for her young age, but when she put it on, strangely, it melded naturally with her beauty, as if the necklace had met its master. The eyes of the man who had given her the necklace shone. He was thinking the girl would be making her social debut in the future, and that she would be a trendsetter. There would be nothing wrong if he favored her somewhat. Not bad. Thank you. Celine smiled sweetly. The store had a colorful interior, but it brightened suddenly with Celine's flowery smile. The staffer couldn't hide his red ears while giving her a slight nod. I'd ask you favor us in the future as well. The necklace around Celine's neck returned to the man's hand by Jessica's hand. That meant that it should be sent with everything else in the morning. She couldn't afford to go around with luxurious items yet. In any case, that man hadn't given her the necklace so that Celine would wear it around immediately. It had been a gift to build a strong relationship. Oh, are you the owner here? Yes, miss. I'll stop by often. Thank you. One whom she had thought to be an employee was in fact the owner. Seeing that he was even tending to a customer by himself, he seemed to run his store with a lot of affection. The store also needed thorough management, as it was the largest and most luxurious jewelry shop in the capital. It was an unexpected harvest. There was nothing wrong with being close to a boutique or a jewelry shop. She would be the first to hear from him when something precious came in, and he might let her know what the latest fashion would be. She would accept the help because not all of her memories were detailed. Of course, the help wouldn't be tremendous since she had been able to make a name for herself in the future and lived as part of high society. While she waited for one of her stupid nights to find a carriage, she had a brief cup of tea. But the stupid night hadn't come back even after the tea had been brewed. Celine, who had already exchanged the tea twice after it had gotten cold, was so impatient that she ordered the other night to find the whereabouts of the first one. Jessica, who realized that Celine did not feel well from experience even if she did not express it, rushed out of the room while saying that she would bring her a new refreshment. Toward her extremely agile retreating figure, Celine added, "You don't have to come back until you're ready." You are sharp. Celine didn't mean to make any trouble with her statement, but she didn't want to see Jessica fretting and squirming. In addition, Celine couldn't be herself, who was in a bad mood due to a number of reasons, with others around. While waiting for Jessica, there was nothing to do, so she opened the window and opened the curtain located in the center of the room. The window that started near Celine's chest and stretched out to the high ceiling was huge enough for her entire body to fall through. Celine sat on a one-man sofa by the window and watched the view out of it, taking care not to let herself fall. Outside the window, the poor and shabby-looking people were busy moving about, unlike those within the painfully colorful jewelry shop. The nobles did not walk, so those who were walking up and down the street were mostly commoners, except for the occasional colorful carriage. Some had tanned, sunburned skin and wore tattered clothes, and there were those whose clothes were all patchworked. Those were the commoners. Some even left holes unrepaired because they could not afford to fix them. Customs offices were present to either side of the jewelry store, like dust against the fancy jewels. I used to wear those clothes too. Her mother had always busied herself with dressing herself up, so she had had to constantly wear old clothes that didn't fit her. Her mother wouldn't have lived such a miserable life if she had paid a little attention to other things, but had never dreamed of such a thing. She had also been desperate to live every day. Celine faced the pieces of her past that passed out the window blankly. Then, she thanked her mother for removing her from that shambling life. She did not want to return to that time and refused to have Lyra push her off a cliff again. "I'll take everything you have and end you horribly. If I can, it wouldn't be a bad idea to hang that pretty face of yours on the wall for treason." Of course, if someone in the family was found to be planning a rebellion, the whole family would be exterminated, but the mere thought of it made her feel better, just the image of the Vermont family, all of whom had their heads hanging from the wall, in her mind. Enjoying the cool autumn breeze, she still thought about how to get rid of Lyra, but suddenly, something foreign, an unusual sight, walked up. The man in the black cloak. She had met him at the general store. Although the hood only revealed his face a little, the subtle contour of his face and the soft-looking hairstyle made her assume that he had an unusual look. Still, even for a nobleman, he had a beautiful face. With that face that was still short of reaching adulthood, he had taken away Celine's freedom and urged her to answer him. He must have noticed Celine's gaze when he came out of the nearby customs building and looked up to her. Celine, who had been frightened by the past and who had not encountered him all this time, was about to stand up immediately, but the expression on the man's face held her down. Did he smile? He was smiling charmingly at her, his mouth in an arc underneath the hood covering his face, as if he had never threatened Celine. Frightened, Celine stepped back a few steps. She was appalled by the way he put his hands near his chest and greeted her politely, as if he would do her no harm. "What's your intention?" He was a man of unknown intention. When he stood at the door and refused to exit fully, the man who was following the cloaked man's footsteps looked troubled, unable to exit as well. Still, the man stood there, facing Celine. Surprised, Celine hurriedly closed the window and drew the curtains to block the view, quickly returning to the sofa located in the center of the room. Even though he was no longer visible, she still recalled his unexpected smile and gaze, which made her feel uneasy. She calmed her mind by wetting her throat with a bit of cold tea. She thought she would not see again. How could there be such a coincidence? Celine, who had once hugged her body while trembling like dried leaves sobbing in the autumn wind, changed her mind. Let's not pay attention to that. He can't be a powerful man if he was coming out of a customs office. Ordinary nobles were bound to let their servants do such chores. Therefore, the nobles did not have to go in and out of government offices in person. If necessary, they could announce themselves through letters or their servants. So, she didn't have to worry about it anymore. She could ignore him. He wouldn't have as much access as he had had and he wouldn't be able to get close to her. In the past and in the future, the distance between them had to have been great enough that they had been barely able to identify each other's faces. Once that stupid night brought the new carriage, she would take it back to the mansion. In the meantime, Jessica would bring her a new refreshment, so she would enjoy a sweet cookie to freshen her mood. Chapter 35. Celine calmly grasped reality and shook off her anxiety by thinking about the various things that were to come. Soon, she became more relaxed and felt the sweet tea on her tongue. As she leaned back on the sofa, enjoying it in a comfortable position, Jessica suddenly entered the room with a servant from the jewelry shop. "I'm sorry I'm late." She bowed immediately to apologize to Celine. The accompanying servant did the same. Celine forgave their sins with a very generous smile. Celine thought it was cute that Jessica had come back when she felt more relieved, and she had also noticed that Jessica had had a bit of luck. "We prepared some jasmine tea and a tart." Jessica and the servant hurriedly arranged the table and set the refreshments. Celine warmed her body with the new tea, which had been chilled slightly by an unexpected encounter with the chilly autumn wind. The sweet and sour tart with strawberries and blueberries melted gently in her mouth. It was not a common tart seen on the market. I think she went to a famous bakery to buy it. It wasn't bad. She felt better and better as she ate the delicious dessert. Around the time 2 slices of the tart had been eaten, the knights who had gone out to find a carriage returned. They seemed to have crawled around like tortoises worn out by old age. No matter how delicious the refreshments were, she did not have to stay at the jewelry store anymore, so she rose from her seat without regret. Celine was escorted by her knights, leaving the jewelry shop behind. The carriage was waiting right in front of the entrance, and that made her feel at ease. Nevertheless, Celine looked carefully around and stuck close to the knights. It would take her only a few steps, but she had to be careful because he had overpowered her knights once. Of course, he would not be waiting for her since he had nothing to do with her, unlike before, but Celine had already died once, so she was careful of unknown dangers. Please, get on the carriage. Nothing happened until she opened the carriage door and took the knight's hand. She felt like she could laugh at her concerns. Celine, standing before the carriage, breathed a small sigh of relief. One more step and she would be able to hide herself in the carriage. But as she was about to take that last step, something suddenly fell on her side. Miss. The knight who saw it quickly knocked it over with his hand. Then, that thing that had suddenly appeared near Celine's face fell to the ground with a crunching sound. When she lowered her gaze and looked at it, she saw it was a bouquet of tulips beautifully wrapped in fine paper and decorative ribbons. Surprised, Celine's body froze, firmly attached to the carriage, and the two escorting knights quickly clung to her earth and drew their swords. The sharp swords were directed at a man who, with an awkward expression, picked up the bouquet that had fallen to the ground. Oh, my God! It was just a gift for the lady who protected my precious fortune. It must have been too sudden. He smiled as if nothing had happened to him as he dusted off the flowers. His casual appearance stunned Celine into silence. Whether it was the same for her knights, they also became mute. The man dusted off the bouquet for a while and handed it back to Celine in a polite manner. She shrank back once more. When the knights tried to stop him from handing her the bouquet of flowers, filling the gap between Celine and the man, he acted preemptively, preventing them from doing so. You rude. It's a small token of appreciation for that last favor. I didn't waste any of my money because of your advice. Celine could not understand most of what he was saying. They were shallow words that seemed more like blackmail. What advice did I give him, and is he thanking me? Celine, who had briefly gazed at the bouquet of flowers hanging next to her, shook her head and refused his favor. No, I don't think we had a thank you type of conversation. At that moment, his face showed great surprise. It seemed like she was saying something bewildering to him, and looking at his burdened expression, Celine frowned. That's not true. Not buying the auction tickets kept us from losing money. Only then was Celine able to understand what the man was saying. It seemed right to assume that he was a countryside aristocrat who had come to the capital for the auction. How did you dare hold my wrist and threaten me so that I couldn't leave? The rudeness of his actions in the past made her feel angry. Moreover, she was annoyed that she had to pay attention to him even though he was a very powerless man. She couldn't even ask Lyra to go out dressed in her dress now to confound the man. The man kept a light smile on his face as Celine frowned and gave no particular answer. He didn't care at all. Even though the two knights could stop him at any time, his posture was completely relaxed and composed. So, I'd like Lady Vermont to accept these tulips, which are protected by the kingdom. Little lady, I hope you will be lucky in the future. It was very natural for people to think she was acquainted with him, who was persistently presenting her the bouquet through a gap between her knights. Sure enough, the knights, who had prevented him from nearing Celine, thought that he had a close relationship with her. Because of that, though their swords were still directed at the man, their nervous bodies were a little relaxed, unlike when he first popped up. Despite the suspicious black cloak and the fact that he didn't take off his hood, they didn't feel any pressure or danger at all. They couldn't believe that he was the same person they had seen at the general store. He didn't seem he would back down until Celine received the bouquet. If that was really the case, there was nothing they could do. Okay, I see. Celine reached out for the bouquet of flowers that had been pushed between the guards. It meant that she would receive it. He had a smile on his face, which could be glimpsed from under the hood. The sight of the two, a young man and a woman offering each other favors, even softened the minds of those watching. The escort knights slid aside to make room. It was only then that the man was able to give Celine the bouquet. Celine accepted it and asked the name of the man who had given her those fragrant and beautiful flowers. Meanwhile, he tried to bow and kneel to her. I can't accept them without knowing your name. I see. I'm sorry. Call me Asterope. No last name? I am sorry, but I can't give you my last name due to some unavoidable circumstances. Celine sighed briefly, looking up and down at Asterope's demeanor. It seemed as if he was more powerless than she had thought, since he wasn't even able to give her his last name. Maybe someone with a pretty face like her mother married a countryside nobleman and gave birth to him. Celine no longer asked Asterope anything, simply taking the bouquet from his hand and placing it in front of one of her escort's face. Just in case, the knight smelled the flowers and confirmed they were safe. Fortunately, he hadn't played any tricks on the flowers, so the escort knight indicated that it was okay. They are ordinary tulips. Celine shook her head when the knight, tough-spirited, took off a few petals and tried to eat them. Asterope wouldn't have done such a meticulous thing in such a short time. Only then did Celine smell the tulips. Their scent and dark color seemed to indicate that they were quite high-priced. As if to reciprocate Asterope's favor, Celine gave him a small curtsy and thanked him. Is this the end of your business? I have to go back to the mansion. Oh, I see. She was telling him to leave. Since he had approached her without warning, she didn't have to show him any more favor. He took a step closer to Celine when he finished answering. The distance that had already been close for someone who had no acquaintance with her became even closer. It was also a distance short enough to enable him to reach out to her. It was the same last time, and he was agile and unpredictable. Chapter 36. Before Celine, startled, took any action, Asterope, on bended knee, reached out for her hand. Celine's face stiffened at the sight of the action she had seen so much elsewhere. No way. May I say goodbye to the back of your hand? No. What nonsense are you saying? You have kept your hood on this entire time, not even showing me yourself. Despite her calm and resolute refusal, Asterope laughed lightly. It seemed that he hadn't wanted her to say yes from the beginning. He rose without regret. Oh, you are a pretty cold woman. You are too hot, aren't you? It's quite different from last time. She had lived a life longer than her years, but it was her first time seeing a rude person like that man, aside from those who had approached her drunk and without measure. Last time, she had been scared to death, but today, she felt like he was acting crazy. Even after Celine's sharp words, he maintained a sudden smile about him. I apologize for what happened the other day. It was very important to me, which is why I'm giving you this kind of reward. Ah. Okay. Then, can I go now? Celine did not listen to Asterope. She had no words to speak to him nor business with him, so she turned around without regret. He wasn't polite, and she didn't want to talk to him anymore. He didn't have to, nor need to, but he was about to see Celine off. Asterope's eyes moved across Celine's body, but his own body did not move a muscle. The deep, blue eyes were full of pure hospitality, without any kind of malice. He is foolish. Celine, trying to get on the carriage while being gazed at by him, suddenly stumbled and dropped the bouquet at her feet. Surprised by this, Celine, her eyes widened, stumbled to pick up the bouquet. She didn't even realize her movements were counterproductive, crushing the flowers. Oh, my goodness. No, that was exactly what Celine was after. It was also a sign that she would not receive the flowers from Asterope. Tulips, which normally had a good smell, quickly soaked up the nasty waste fluid underneath the carriage due to Celine's very natural movements. What a coincidence. Because he had only chosen petals, the way she had crushed them made it impossible to recognize the original. Celine, who determined that she could not pick them up, raised her body with a sad look on her face. On her behalf, one of the knights picked up the pitiful bouquet. The tulips, which had just boasted superlative beauty, had now turned into a messy heap that would sour the mood of those who looked at them. What shall I do with this? Asterope stared at Celine with a firm face. She faced his eyes for a while as if to say she was very sorry, and he smiled as if he remained cheerful. It was obvious that he should be in a bad mood, but he looked very well, like he had been waiting for that. I don't think such an ugly bouquet suits you, so I think it's better to throw it away. Even though he had been offended, he looked very happy. He looked like a beast that had found its prey. How dare you? It was Celine who was offended by this. She had expected a contorted face, but like she had imagined, the man's thoughts were a mystery to her. Well, can I ask you to do it? Yes. The ugly bouquet went back to Asterope. The crushed flowers and his beastly eyes somehow strangely matched and made her shudder. Celine hurried into the carriage. At the urging of her immediate departure, the carriage rushed to her destination, and Asterope's expression turned cold again while he stared at the carriage for a while, still without taking off his hood. The carriage the knight had borrowed was luckily as good as the time she had had to wait. Misfortune did not seem to continue, and she was able to get back to the mansion without discomfort in that pleasant and comfortable carriage. Nevertheless, Celine couldn't afford to appreciate the trip. She was confused by her thoughts on Asterope. What the hell is he doing? There was silence in the carriage ride back to the mansion. Celine, looking roughly at the scenery passing through the window, recalled the look that had bothered her. I'm sure he has some intention. Otherwise, it didn't make sense to suddenly change and pretend to be close to her. Why on earth? What made him change? And what did he see in me that makes him want to be close to me? The unexpected man kept dominating her mind, so she was confused. Let's stop. It's not this trivial thing that I have to think about now. Celine shook her head to shake off her thoughts. On her way home to the mansion, she immediately caught the driver who had driven the rattling carriage and ordered a servant to bring the driver who had returned first because of a stomach ache to her. She did so to confirm whether the story was true or false. She thought it was probably a lie. Unfortunately, however, the answer was not what she expected. He is in the hospital? Yes, he looks very ill. He kept complaining of a stomach ache and nausea. Did that happen because he really was sick? No, there couldn't be such a coincidence. Even he was really ill, someone must have made him sick. It was not a chance. When she thought of the driver sweating profusely, she did not think it was a coincidence. It was clearly a situation intended by someone. Go get his status, whether he really is sick and where he is interned. Yes, miss. At Celine's order, John went straight to check on the driver's condition. Fortunately, he was hospitalized at a nearby hospital, which gave her quick access to the news. The doctor diagnosed the driver's disease as food poisoning. He had a hasty lunch waiting for Celine, so the doctor guessed that the seafood from that lunch had gone bad. By the way, the driver's wife, who ate the same lunch as him, is fine. Yes, she must have eaten first, then the driver arrived at the mansion late and ate what was left of hers. Is that so? That's a pity. There was no way the food would go bad that quickly with the cool autumn wind blowing. Celine's lips twisted when she heard John's report. She concluded that this had been the situation intended by a specific person. The person was a very small, clever, and terrible little girl. Is it because of the gift I received from Oscar? If that was the real reason, it was very childish and funny. If a lover showed favor to others, she should not afflict others, but instead, try to win his heart. The only thing she gained by bullying someone was a momentary joy. It was what Celine had experienced and realized in the past. You're going to go mad, smoothly. It was only a matter of time before she would be ruined because Celine's goal was not to do purposeless evil, but to affect her feelings, unlike in the past. Even if she had suffered unpleasantness in the past, Celine's thoughts were not wrong. Do I have to get out of here now? There was only emotional evidence that Lyra would be behind this. Moreover, no matter how much Lyra plotted, Celine could not easily accuse her because the absolute goodwill of all was still directed at Lyra. There are many ways. Of course, she would punish those who had participated in this matter. It was necessary to make them admit their crimes and drive them away. She was going to kick them out, pretending she didn't notice it as much as she could while looking pitiful. Celine gave a lot of praise to John, who had learned that the carriage that had rattled badly had been broken. Some parts had been missing, and with that information, she headed to the Countess' room. The Countess had just returned home. The Count had been absent for a long time, and all the power of the mansion had fallen on her. To ask for help from the Countess, who was entirely on Celine's side, was as easy as ordering Jessica to bring her tea. Chapter 37. Slightly disheveled and with a sweet smell of alcohol permeating about her, the Countess was being served by her maids, who were removing her clothes and ornaments from her body. Then, she stretched out on her bed with nothing on. She was not asleep, so she had plenty of room for conversation. "I have something to talk to my mother about, so everyone, get out." Celine, making all the servants who were massaging her body and face leave the room, sat by the Countess' head and fiddled with her shiny hair. The Countess, who knew she was affectionate only when she had a request, slowly blinked her drunken eyes and asked her reason. "What's the matter?" "It's not a big deal, but I think I should tell you because it happened under the rose scent name. I almost had a big accident earlier." "A big accident?" "A carriage accident. I was almost hurt." The drunkenness on her mother's face suddenly lifted, when she heard that her only daughter had nearly been into a major accident. There was still a flush on both of her cheeks, but the clear look in her eyes made Celine feel her mother's affection, which had a mixture of anxiety and worry. Celine smiled a little at this, and her mother frowned. "Explain to me what you are saying. You almost had an accident?" "I almost had a big accident. My stupid driver came home without his master's permission and got food poisoning while eating lunch, and the driver who replaced the stupid one brought a broken carriage. It was as if he had done it on purpose. Thanks to that broken carriage, her hips and back were still tingling a little." The Countess' face showed a horrified expression when Celine said that they had been very rude and had not admitted their guilt. "If that's true, I can't forgive them. Nothing of it was reported to me. But, forget me. Mother, who is the master of the mansion, also did not receive any reports of the events. Maybe the mansion still considers my mother and me to be useless beings. I'm terribly sad." Though needless to remind her of that, it was true enough to provoke the anger of the Countess. The Countess dressed straight away and called for all the servants and maids of the mansion. Not long after her call, they gathered in the hall on the first floor. Unlike the usual languid looks that were directed at them, those who first saw the Countess' sharp and resolute eyes looked puzzled. Of course, some of them were even terrified, shaking uncontrollably, like the driver that had teased Celine earlier. The Countess' mood was ominous, and all the servants and maids closed their mouths and looked down at the floor when they saw her. Breaking that silence, the Countess began to tell everyone about what had happened that day and asked them whether it was true or not. "So, is it true that the driver named Yagi left his station without asking Celine for permission, and that another driver headed for the mansion on his behalf, but also made no report, even taking the broken carriage and nearly causing a major accident?" The Countess' gaze reached Elect, and dozens of eyes fell on him because he was the only one to question. Elect slowly began to make an excuse, as if he had prepared himself to handle all these questions and eyes alone. "It happened so suddenly that I think I took the wrong carriage." "You took the wrong carriage? Then, the transportation manager who made you take the wrong one must have neglected his job." When the Countess tried to pass the guilt onto the transportation manager, he jumped up and countered that it would have never happened that way. His face turned red, and he looked distraught by the false accusations. "It couldn't be. In the first place, we keep broken carriages in a different storage area. The carriage taken by Elect was stored away from the main building." "Is that true?" "Yes. That's been a rule since the inception of the family, and everyone on staff knows about it." With his impassioned response, those who supported his statement nodded, affirming that he was right. Everyone had known of it without even asking, so there would have been no need for it to be repeated. The Countess was driving the driver into a corner quite smoothly. Celine, who watched the situation quietly next to her, mentioned a man who was not involved in the matter to drive the driver into a swamp the driver would be unable to get out of. "Mother, isn't it the butler's job to direct the servants to work, so wouldn't he be the one who ordered it? Otherwise, the driver wouldn't have taken the broken carriage." "Did the butler really do that?" Frank, the butler, was a man who had worked in the mansion for years and had devoted himself in body and mind to the family. Everyone thought Celine's statement was ridiculous, but it wasn't impossible, so they waited anxiously for his excuse. Unfortunately, however, he soon failed to assert his innocence. "Is the butler involved?" Based on her past experience, Celine had thought him to be a neutral party. Now, she was not sure he was not involved in this. He was an unexpected participant. Even Celine looked at him with doubt, and in that instant, he spoke of his incompetence with a dark, dead face. I'm ashamed to tell you, but I didn't know of this until just a moment ago, even though it's my job to know and manage everything that's going on in the mansion. I just thought Yagi came here for lunch because Miss Celine gave him permission, and that Elect traded places with him in a fine carriage. Of course, I thought they hadn't forgotten to make their reports. I didn't doubt the events because it was the natural thing to do. I'm so sorry. After he finished speaking, he bowed deeply and admitted his faults, remaining bent over even as time passed. Did you have any idea about this? What should we do? A lament came from someone's mouth. It was not just one or two who were surprised by his mistakes, he who had always managed the mansion wisely. Celine glared at him for some time. That was because she was worried about whether to let him go or save him, along with the drivers. He was not a friendly man to Celine and her mother, but he was not neglectful of his work or partial to anyone. She thought that if he was at least neutral, he wouldn't disturb her. Shall I save him? Moreover, on the outside, it would be good if most people in the mansion followed the butler and trusted him. He's always been neat about his work, so there's no question there. I can't help but think that they purposely orchestrated this to avoid his eyes. I'm sure they did it because they don't trust me. I'm so sad. When Celine finally uttered a word of defense for him, the butler trembled once. He didn't seem to have thought that she would help himself. The butler, who had been saved by Celine, was removed from this matter, and all the blame was placed on the drivers. Celine looked over at Lyra, who was standing hard-faced in a corner a little away from the Countess. Now, Lyra, how are you going to respond to this? I'd better call the Capitol Guards. Inevitably, the Countess asked back, surprised by Celine's words, the Capitol Guards? If the driver intentionally picked the broken carriage, there had to be a scheme to harm me. I returned safely to the mansion, but if things had gone wrong, the carriage could have collapsed, and I might have died. Besides, Celine continued, looking around at the crowd in the hall, if the butler didn't know of it, that means they had planned to harm me on purpose. Everyone's face looked shocked by the terrible conclusion. In fact, that was the most plausible conclusion. They didn't like Celine, so it had all been planned. Of course, there were only a few parts missing from the wagon and not enough to cause a major accident, but only a few people knew about that. In addition, there was an assumption that it had happened that way, so no one could plead for the driver, except for Lyra, who she assumed had orchestrated that situation. Chapter 38. Lyra, who had been watching the events unfold quietly and at a distance, sided with the driver, saying, "Isn't that too much? Well, mother and sister. Isn't calling the Capitol Guards a little too much? He might have forgotten what to do because he is near retirement. No one's hurt. It's a little sad to think like that." Surely, the driver was about to retire at the age of 60. He was old enough to be believed that his memory oscillated due to some illness. So, it made sense that he might have confused the place where the wagon was stored. No one was seriously injured, like Lyra had said, and the carriage returned safely. There was nothing to blame, except that the ride was uncomfortable because it rattled so much and that things had not been reported. There were only a few parts missing in the first place, and that wasn't enough to cause an accident. Therefore, it was a matter requiring a minimum of disciplinary action, such as a pay cut, if given a little mercy. Lyra might have thought she could end it like that. Maybe it had been a little prank on a wicked woman who had been favored by her lover. But Celine had no intention of doing so. Why? Because if they ever joined Lyra, Celine was going to show her willingness to retaliate beyond Lyra's control. That way, no one would be willing to stick to that stupid girl in the future. Lyra. I'm sorry. Did you forget I might have died in a scary accident? Death? It wasn't enough for that, was it? The carriage came back safely. From Lyra's way of speaking, Celine asked back in surprise, barely tolerating internal cheering within her at that moment, Lyra, how do you know that? How do you know it wasn't bad? All she said was that there were a few parts missing. If major parts were missing, not tiny ones, they could naturally lead to a large-scale accident. She hadn't explained anything about it, so how did Lyra know? The stupidity to tell them what you did wrong. Noticing that she had said too much, Lyra's complexion darkened immediately. It was sad to see Lyra holding tightly to Emma's hand. Celine wanted to twist her hand. Where did you hear that? When Celine urged her, Lyra, who could not answer, bit her lip. Emma whispered in a low voice, so as not to be heard away from the ears of her master, who was trembling like a pathetic baby bird. She seemed to be suggesting a way to avoid the situation. Emma looked very serious. Celine observed the exchange closely. Sure enough, Lyra soon gave an excuse for what Celine had said. I was talking about the result, sister. It's not that bad because you weren't hurt. Yes, Lyra. What you say makes sense. Suddenly, Celine took a step back, and her daughter's words made the Countess' eyes turn to her. They seemed to ask what Celine's intention was. Celine looked a little gloomy, but then answered the reason why she agreed with Lyra. But you should bear in mind that I could have been badly hurt. Maybe I was lucky that I wasn't. That's right. Lyra gave a reluctant affirmation. If she denied Celine here, she would seem to be strangely defending the offenders, and that wasn't possible anymore. Still, it's a good thing I'm the one who rode that carriage. Imagine if you had ridden in it with a few parts missing. Just imagining it makes me feel like I'm about to faint. So, it's very strange if you stick by the driver here. Do you understand? You have to take my side, the side of your only elder sister. Punish the driver you control with your own hand. That was the conclusion that Celine wanted for the incident. Celine's trap kept Lyra from answering. If she answered positively, she would be kicking the driver out, and if she answered negatively, all of their suspicions would fall on her. Now, what do you want to do? The driver's face turned pale, as if he were a living corpse. He waited for the punishment because he dared not make an excuse. Celine hid her face in her mother's clothes, pretending to wipe away the tears that had not flowed. She was also trying to hide her smile, which was about to burst forth. Silence fell on the hall, but Lyra still said nothing. The Countess had noticed her daughter, who had been cleverly scheming something for some time, so she quietly watched everything unfold. She didn't know what it was that Celine was planning, but it was obvious that she bringing everything to an interesting conclusion. Celine, who hid her joy away in the Countess' hem, asked Lyra with a gloomy face, "Of course, you do as well, right, Lyra?" "Of course." "Then, let's ask our loving mother to make a fair and wise judgment, as it seems that the situation is now settled." There was no way for her to make a fair and wise judgment. Celine was her only biological daughter. Things were very advantageous for Celine, so it was clear that she would make the judgment Celine wanted. When Lyra refused to answer, with her eyelashes trembling and her lips serrated, Celine asked for consent, saying, "What do you think? Come on, kick the driver out by yourself. Fire him, who has been working for you." Celine's sad-looking eyes flashed. They were like the eyes of the snake that had handed the apple to the man at the beginning of human history. The distraught face hastened Lyra's response. She had no choice. She just had to bite the apple that the snake was given her. "That's a good idea." The driver, whose legs loosened, sank to the floor. Emma, her maid, held Lyra by the arm and shoulder firmly and quickly disappeared into the corner. Celine wanted to give a round of applause to those who had kept their composure until the very end, but she bore her desire and smiled faintly with a slightly wistful face, expectant of her mother's just judgment. The sentence was postponed to the next day. That was because the exchange had happened late at night. It was not necessary to delay it, but to appear to be making a prudent ruling, and the Countess declared that she would decide the sentence for him after breakfast in the morning. Perhaps, she had already settled on a result. The next day, Celine, who entered the dining hall for breakfast, saw the empty chairs and asked a servant, "What about Lyra?" She said she was eating in her room because she was not feeling well. Really? Lyra had eaten most of her meals in her room, but for today, Celine seemed to be able to understand why she had confined herself to her room for breakfast. You're going to feel like you have a stomach ache. Just looking at Celine's face would make her sick because it had always been like that for her. Sadly, why did you play such a foolish trick on me and instill distrust within your people? If you want to scheme against me, you should be clever. Of course, Lyra would think she was smart at the moment, and it was clear that she considered Celine to be relatively stupid, but things were actually different. No matter how smart she was, she couldn't have beaten Celine, who had lived for more than 20 years. Celine finished a neat, clean breakfast with the Countess, who showed up a little after mealtime. Perhaps, the menu would have felt bitter for Lyra, but it was a very satisfying one for Celine. After enjoying the leisurely breakfast, the butler took hold of her as she left the dining hall and headed, along with the Countess, to sentence the driver. Miss, there's someone from the jewelry store here. He's waiting at the front door. The butler had a softer than usual look, unlike his usual stiff, rigid face when he dealt with Celine. When she saw his face changed, she immediately realized how hard and foolishly she had lived previously. Really? Thank you. That was why she added words that were not usually necessary. The butler's eyes were still tender. I think the gift I prepared in return for the dress Mr. Oscar gave me has arrived. Oh, my. Go quickly and get it. It won't take long. Celine turned her steps towards the hall and moved to the front door. The face of the jewelry shop servant brightened as soon as he saw her. He had apparently been waiting for Celine to finish her meal. Chapter 39. Celine was thrilled to see the brooch he had brought. Perfect. Thank you, miss. My master has left me with a message that he wants you to favor us in the future for your needs. Please, tell him I'll do that. It seemed normal to finish the exchange with flattery. The strange lily-shaped craftsmanship brought the red ruby together in perfect harmony. He hadn't had to make it as great as it was for her, which made her feel even better about it. How could everything be so smooth? He bowed deeply at the waist, and leaving behind the servant of the jewelry shop who had given her his courtesy, she walked alone to the hall to decide the fate of the driver. Jessica, who had in her hands the package containing the brooches and the necklace, followed her. Celine smiled brightly while imagining Lyra's crumpled face. As per Celine's wish, the driver was fired. He had to be kicked out without receiving any severance pay. That was the judgment of the benevolent Countess. He could not resist leaving the capital since he was guilty of trying to harm his master. I fire elect, the driver, from the employ of the family of Count Rosent. The Countess' clear voice filled the wide hall. The driver fell to the floor, apparently unable to sleep all night. Lyra's complexion was also pale. Also, Yagi, who deserted his place of work, will be reassigned to work at the stables. His duty will be cleaning them. Because of the food poisoning, Yagi had been absent without leave from the workplace, so now, he was reassigned. He was in charge of cleaning the stables, like the young servants who had just entered the mansion. Maybe, he'll quit. He won't get promoted for the rest of his life because he's out of favor with his master. It was a very satisfactory result. If there were followers that were not slaves to Lyra, those around her would think a little about the treatment they might incur with this incident. I'm not feeling well, so I'll have to go up, Lyra said meekly. The pale complexion of Lyra, who seemed about to faint at any moment, made everyone in the mansion worry about her health with a single heart. They seemed to think that she was shocked by her sister's terrible circumstances. Celine did not forget to say words of thanks with a moved expression at Lyra's warm heart, for she had come forward worried about Celine's well-being and livelihood. Yes. That's what you'll do. You haven't looked so well since last night, so I think you should get some rest. Thank you so much for taking care of me. No, sister. It's natural that I worry. She would never have worried about Celine, but Lyra had to nod as if she had. Before she left, Celine reached out to Jessica, who was waiting behind her. Wait a minute, Lyra. Jessica, can you give me the necklace that arrived from the jewelry store today? Yes? Yes, miss. It's kind of weird to give it to you in a situation like this, but... Lyra, I think it would look good on you." Celine delivered it to her maid, who accepted on behalf of Lyra, who was about to collapse. The maid, who had lots of freckles on her nose, had wronged and envied her both in the past and even now by Lyra's side. Celine was familiar with her, so she handed the necklace over to the maid on purpose. At Celine's instruction, the maid opened the case she had received from Celine and showed its content. Oh, my God! Inside was the sapphire necklace given by the owner of the jewelry shop. Lyra's maid expressed her admiration without even realizing her shame. The eyes of all who saw it were wide open by its size and shine. Of course, it wasn't as great as the jewels and clothing that Lyra had, but it wasn't negligible. Why did Celine give that necklace to Lyra? Everyone had that question in mind. Jessica, Celine's maid, felt the same way. Why would she give the necklace she received as a gift to Lyra? Celine approached Lyra with a very sorry expression and said, "I borrowed your clothes last time and couldn't even pay you back. I'm sorry. It was too much for a single use of a dress." Of course, for Lyra, who knew the value of the garment, it wouldn't have been enough even if Celine had brought a carriage full of jewels, but it was enough for those who didn't know the truth. "Don't you like it?" "No, no. Thank you, sister." Lyra couldn't help but accept it. Lyra had lent her a dress only once and received a great jewel in return. She didn't need a necklace and didn't have a mind to wear it, but Celine was able to portray the friendly sister that way. But now, Lyra's heart was possibly turned upside down. She had lent the dress, which Oscar had given her as a gift, to someone whom she hated the most and wanted to kill, but she had to forgive that with just a jewel. She felt like she was burning to death by an ember, so she wasn't well at all. "Would you like to wear it immediately?" "Shall I?" Celine picked up the necklace by hand and approached Lyra. Her slender neck, stiffened and with golden brilliant hair on top, looked so weak that it made Celine laugh. It seemed like it would easily break if she applied a little more strength, and that impulse overwhelmed Celine. But, without even hinting at her desire, she simply hung the necklace around her neck softly. It would not be fun if Mile lost her life without reason. She deserved to die after she was thoroughly exposed and disgraced. Unfortunately or fortunately, Lyra and the necklace matched very well, and the majority of those there blessed the friendly sisters. Lyra still smiled awkwardly, pale as if about to faint, and hurriedly left, saying that she felt ill. "I think everything is settled then, so I'll have to go up. I have to go out in the afternoon." "You've had a hard time, Mother. Thank you for making the right decision. Now that your father's gone out, of course, it's my job." How can she be so casual when she has neglected her duties so far? Celine, swallowing a smile, followed her up to her room. Celine, who decided to take a break while Jessica was preparing a servant to send to Oscar, enjoyed that day's victory while drinking the herbal tea prepared by Jessica. How grieved must the driver be now that his master has driven him into the abyss. It would be nice if he could grind the sword of revenge and cut off that slender neck. But that wouldn't happen. Lyra, or perhaps even her slaves, would join forces to make the driver's life convenient, and he would spend his later years content with her crude care. 'Cause this isn't the only chance. Celine couldn't destroy that wicked girl at the very start. It wasn't a great thing to do such a thing in the first place, and if Lyra rejected the matter altogether, she would get out of any association with it. Besides, there was something that was bothering her. Lyra had always clung to a maid in particular, and that reminded Celine of whom Lyra had had in the past. Emma. Lyra, who had lost her mother, had been attached to the maid as if she were her mother. Emma also seemed to regard Lyra as special. Celine thought that day's incident might not be Lyra's own evil deed when she observed Emma giving Lyra advice. Lyra, currently, was like a very small, young deer. If so, I'll have to look into that maid, Emma. I'll use that freckled maid first. Celine had a hunch that Emma would also be involved in her death. She felt it as though it wasn't mere conjecture. So, she couldn't let her go. If that hunch was true, she would separate her bones from her flesh and throw them into the feet of a beast. When she recalled that Emma had always cast an unpleasant glance at her by Lyra's side in the past, it made her feel goosebumps across her neck. That was because the anxiety of her death seemed not to have disappeared. Celine, who had touched her neck for a while, rose up and approached the landscape painting on the wall. When she pushed against the blank wall behind it, a handle appeared that led to a secret space. Chapter 40. Celine, who opened the door and took out the well-hidden box inside, put the box on the table. My benefactor, savior of my life. When she opened the lid and touched the hourglass, she felt a little relieved. It's all right. That stupid woman who'd been decapitated in the past was no more. There was only a pioneer, who would kill the demons that would later kill her. While she comforted herself for a moment, she heard Jessica's voice, followed by a careful knock on the door. Miss, I have someone ready to deliver the goods. Really? Come in. You prepared everything earlier than I thought. The letter was not ready, so she took out the paper the owner of the jewelry shop enclosed with the brooches. There were as many as 5 sheets of paper in the case. Fortunately, without making any mistakes, Celine only used one of them. She briefly expressed her gratitude without writing anything profound. Oscar Frederick. I don't know what to say for your gift of thanks for my handkerchief. This is a small token of sincerity, so please accept it. Celine Vermont. She wrote it all down briefly. The brooch was being sent by a poor young lady in plain clothes, so he would surely respond without accepting it. How's the handwriting? You wrote it in a kind and beautiful style. When did she even practice handwriting like that? Jessica's eyes widened because she hadn't seen Celine writing anything down before or practicing. Her handwriting had become naturally calibrated as she had grown older, and it eventually became quite worthy to see. Of course, that meant that her handwriting was better than those of the young ladies of her age. It was still clumsy and sloppy when compared to adults, and that was when she remembered that she had always had someone to help her or to write for her as a ghostwriter. It'll be weird if my calligraphy is too good. Celine contentedly ordered the envelope to be sealed. Please, deliver it with the gift. Yes, miss. Jessica organized what was on the table and sealed the written letter in an envelope. She carefully packed the box with the gift so as to prevent it from being twisted or broken, and stamped the seal of the Vermonts on the lid to announce the sender. It was not a fancy package, so it would be seen as a simple and neat gift. Unlike the present he had sent, it was also small in size. No one would expect a very expensive brooch to be inside that package. Tell him to deliver it as soon as possible. Yes, miss. That way, she would be able to see Lyra's distorted face as soon as possible. Jessica left the room, and Celine pulled the hourglass out of the box. The thing was the size of her palm, and she wanted to see if it was okay. It was perfect, without a grain of dust on it, thanks to the fact that she completely hid it in a box that no one could touch. Celine turned the hourglass over and put it on the table to make sure the sand was falling through well. Then, the grains of sand, glistening as finely as snow, fell gently down. When she found out that the hourglass was operating safely, Celine was a little relieved and leaned against the back of the chair, breathing out a small sigh. It was then that. Shall I bring more tea? Huh. It had just been a moment of relief, but when she turned her head, startled by the sudden voice, she found Jessica standing at the threshold of her room. Why? Why is she back inside when she just stepped out of the room? I never asked her to come in. I can't understand why she's back in here. I didn't call you. What's going on? Did you forget something? Celine thought Jessica might have forgotten something. She could not have gone down to the first floor so quickly to have come back after delivering the package. When asked about it, Jessica looked puzzled. Yes? I was just waiting for you to write the letter. What are you talking about? You just took the letter. Jessica didn't answer anything, just blinking instead. Are you out of your mind? Celine, who shook her head and looked away, suddenly realized that she had something in her hand. A quill? Why? And the letterhead was on the table. There was a piece of paper with, "Dear Oscar Frederick," written on it. The secret of the hourglass. This. What is it? Why is this in my hand? And why is the letter paper on the table again? Didn't she just take it? Rather, why am I writing the same letter again? Celine looked at Jessica questioningly, but Jessica couldn't answer anything. Jessica was just looking at her master's sudden expression, unable to understand why Celine was saying that. Pow! Celine, who nervously slammed the quill down onto the table, waved Jessica out. Just deliver the goods as soon as possible. But, I need a letter from you. You took the letter, didn't you? No. No, I didn't take it, Jessica answered with a flinch at Celine's biting reaction. It seemed that Jessica was remembering that Celine would find fault with everything in the past, making a lot of trouble for her. Jessica. Celine's eyes grew sharper. If Jessica talked back once more, Celine would start throwing things at her. Of course, the present Celine had no intention of doing that, but she was thinking that she should act as Jessica expected of her. But, Jessica couldn't just go out. So, she gathered great courage to open her mouth to speak again. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, miss, but you have to give me a letter so that I can send the gift. Even though she was young, was she already going senile? Celine sighed and took the quill back into her hand. Jessica, like she had been in the past, was very stubborn. So, even when she had been shaking with fear, Jessica had sometimes scolded Celine, who had truly been a wicked child. Who? Okay. Celine would like to enjoy that day's victory, and she didn't want to upset herself with such a trifle, so she wrote the letter again, thinking that Jessica must have gone mad all of a sudden. Soon, Jessica, who sealed the envelope with a pale face and pocketed it with the gift, hurriedly left Celine's room. After she went out, Celine watched the hourglass drop its last grain of sand. As expected, there seemed to be nothing unusual. She didn't like the messy things on the table, so she sorted them aside and suddenly she noticed something strange. By the way, why are there 4 pieces of letter paper left? Because Jessica had insisted that she had not taken the first letter, Celine had used up 2 pieces of letter paper. So, there should have been 3 pieces of letter paper left, as she had written on 2 of them. But no matter how many times she counted the letter paper pieces, there were 4. Why? Why? She thought about it for a long time, but she couldn't find an answer. Then, she came to a conclusion: she might have counted the number of sheets wrong at first. That's the only answer. But there was another strange thing. Obviously, Jessica, who had taken the brooch before, took it out of the drawer, where she had temporarily stored it, again. That was extremely weird. Did she put it back in the drawer without me seeing it? Celine had only had 1 box prepared for the gift, but she saw it with her own eyes that Jessica had taken the brooch out again, even though she didn't see her put it back in the drawer. What the hell is going on? She was so confused by things that she thought a ghost might be playing tricks on her, or something that she couldn't understand was happening. Maybe. Is it me, and not Jessica, who's crazy? It was strange, but she soon dismissed it as a mistake because she was tired. Sure enough, her mind went blank, her eyes closed, and there came a yawn. I guess it's because I'm tired. I need a little rest. There was nothing in a particular set for later. There would be no visits from her tutors, and there was quite a bit of time left before dinner. It would be okay if I got up after a short nap. Celine lay herself on her soft bed without changing her clothes. Celine, who closed her eyes to the beckoning of sleep, soon fell victim to it soundly.